meters below the surface chop, on a course that every Russian naval planner had declared mathematically impossible. They were wrong. I'm your host at Conflict East, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What you're about to hear is the story of one of the most audacious maritime strikes of the entire conflict. A GUR operation that didn't just hit a target, it dismantled a strategic assumption the Russian Navy had built its entire Black Sea defense posture around. The assumption was this: Novorossiysk cannot be reached by Ukrainian naval drones. The harbor sits behind a massive reinforced concrete breakwater. Ka-27 helicopters patrol the outer approaches on rotating 6-hour cycles. Acoustic barrier arrays were installed beneath the surface to detect the distinctive cavitation signatures of incoming drone craft. The shore-based ISR cell at the Naval Command building on Seams Bay runs 24-hour surveillance radar coverage of every approach vector. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, battered and reduced after successive Ukrainian maritime strikes, had concentrated whatever remained of its serious naval infrastructure here, at this port, and wrapped it in the most comprehensive defensive network it could construct. The Sheskhary's petroleum terminal is why. Sheskhary's is not just a fuel export facility. It is the single largest crude oil export node still functioning for Russian energy revenue. After Ukrainian long-range strikes disrupted Baltic pipeline transit and forced insurance rates on Russian cargo vessels into commercially unviable territory, Sheskhary's became the choke point through which Russian petroleum wealth flowed to international markets. Novorossiysk became, in essence, Russia's economic jugular, which made it the most logical target in the entire conflict, and also, Russian command believed, the most protected. To understand what GUR's Maritime Operations Directorate planned, you have to understand the geography of Novorossiysk Harbor. The main channel through the breakwater faces northeast, into prevailing wind patterns that create a predictable surface chop of between 40 and 80 centimeters during typical overnight hours. The outer anchorage, where the tanker quay positions, sits in a natural bowl partially sheltered by the Caucasus foothills to the east. The Ka-27 patrol helicopters fly standard racetracks covering the open Black Sea approaches, the obvious vectors. The acoustic arrays were installed along the primary deep water approach lanes. But there is a secondary vector. A shallow draft lane running along the inner coastline, used by small commercial traffic and fishing vessels, that threads inside the acoustic array perimeter before intersecting the outer breakwater. It was never a serious attack concern because it required navigating roughly 12 kilometers of coastal shallows at depths between 2 and 4 meters, threading through a cluster of moored fishing vessels near the village of Abrau-Djurso, and then making a final approach in the shadow of the breakwater itself, all while avoiding the rotational sweep of 3 separate radar emitters. GUR's planning cell studied this lane for 4 months. What they found was an obstacle that looked insurmountable but contained one exploitable seam. The shore-based ISR cell that provides the radar picture for the harbor defense system operates on a handoff cycle. The day crew, running the highest resolution tracking software, ends its shift. The night crew takes over. During that handoff, a window of approximately 18 minutes while both crews are in transition, running system checks, the outgoing crew briefing the incoming team. The radar picture is being reviewed by people who are distracted, logging out, and logging in. 18 minutes. That is the seam. Which weapon do you think posed the greater threat to Russia's naval infrastructure at Novorossiysk? A. HIMARS precision strikes from land. B. Storm Shadow cruise missiles from Ukrainian aircraft. C. Sea Baby maritime drones navigating the coastal approach. Drop your answer in the comments. The answer may surprise you. The Sea Baby drone program emerged from Ukraine's broader autonomous weapons initiative in the earlier phases of the conflict. By the period of this operation, the platform had undergone significant evolution. The version deployed in this strike was operating at its 3rd-generation configuration. A fiberglass hull roughly 5.5 meters in length, displacing approximately 1 metric ton fully loaded. The propulsion system had been upgraded to a pair of electric motors driving shrouded propellers, reducing acoustic signature dramatically compared to earlier variants. Navigation ran on a hybrid system combining preloaded GPS waypoints with terrain-following sonar for shallow water obstacle avoidance and a passive optical sensor array that could recognize landmark features for position correction. The explosive payload was the critical modification. Each drone carried between 200 and 250 kilograms of combined shape, charge, and fragmentation explosive, configured in a forward-penetrating warhead design. The intent was not to sink vessels. These were not torpedo-style systems. The intent was to breach hull plating and ignite cargo. 8 drones, 2,000 kilograms of explosive. Against 43 tankers at anchor and a petroleum terminal processing 40,000 barrels per day. Stay with me, because what happens in the next sequence fundamentally changes how naval analysts understand harbor defense against autonomous maritime weapons. This isn't just a strike report. It's a case study in how Ukraine exploits predictability. The planning phase lasted 4 months. The execution phase lasted less than 3 hours. Gior's maritime cell had identified 3 categories of problem that needed to be solved simultaneously. The first problem was launch position. The Sea Baby drones needed to enter the water at a point that placed them on the coastal shallow draft vector without crossing the acoustic array perimeter before they could reach minimum detection depth. Satellite analysis of fishing vessel traffic patterns identified a small cove near Abrau where local boats habitually anchored overnight. This created natural radar clutter. Intermittent surface contacts that harbor radar operators had learned to filter as non-threatening. A maritime insertion team operating from a converted civilian vessel positioned the launch platform within this clutter zone, using the fishing vessel signatures as masking. The second problem was the Ka-27 helicopters. Their patrol schedule was not unknown to Ukrainian intelligence. OSINT analysis of flight tracking data, intercepted radio transmissions, and human intelligence assets operating in the port city had reconstructed the rotation cycle with high confidence. The helicopters flew 2 ship pairs on alternating 6-hour tracks. Shift change for the helicopter crews corresponded, not by accident, with a period of reduced patrol density as aircraft returned for crew rotation and refueling. This reduced overflight coverage by roughly 40% during the transition period. The third problem was timing the strike to coincide with both the ISR cell handoff and the helicopter rotation minimum. Those 2 windows did not naturally overlap. The ISR handoff happened at a fixed time. The helicopter rotation happened at a different fixed time. The gap between them was approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. 2 hours and 40 minutes was exactly how long it took the Sea Baby drones to navigate the coastal shallow draft lane from the launch position to the inner breakwater approach at 4 knots. The synchronization was not a coincidence. Gior's planning cell had worked backward from the ISR handoff window, calculated the required transit time, and identified the helicopter rotation minimum that preceded it by the necessary margin. The launch time was set to place the drones at the inner breakwater at the precise moment the ISR handoff was underway and helicopter coverage was at its minimum. How many tankers did the Sea Baby strike package reach before Russian defensive systems engaged? A 4B6C9. Hold that number in your mind. The answer comes at the end, and it changes everything about how you'll think about harbor defense. Here is the complication no one planned for. 3 hours before the planned launch, one of the 8 drones developed a navigation system fault. The onboard position correction software flagged a calibration error in the passive optical sensor array, the system used for landmark recognition and position correction in the shallow water transit. Without it, the drone could follow its preloaded GPS waypoints but could not perform the precision terminal guidance needed to thread the inner breakwater gap. In the shallow approach lane, a navigation error of more than 8 meters would ground the drone on the mud-flat shelf running along the northern edge of the channel. The mission controller had 40 minutes to make a decision. The options were: abort the affected drone and launch with 7, recalibrate the sensor array manually, a process that required physical access to the drone and could not be completed in the available window, or accept degraded navigation on that drone and attempt the transit at reduced speed with manual remote correction through the encrypted data link. The decision was to launch 7 drones on full autonomous profile and hold the 8th in reserve, to be launched manually via data link with a human operator providing real-time navigation corrections through the shallow section. This added a human operator to the mission profile who would need to maintain encrypted communications with the 8th drone throughout its 2-hour 40-minute transit. Every minute of that data link represented a potential emission signature that Russian signals intelligence could detect. The operator accepted the risk. 7 drones slid beneath the surface of the cove at the designated launch time, already running on their autonomous profiles. The 8th drone entered the water 30 seconds later, its operator 200 kilometers away in a hardened communications facility, watching a blurred sonar feed and navigating by feel. Subscribe to Conflict East if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happens in those 3 hours of silent transit is what separates doctrine from reality. The 7 autonomous drones navigated the coastal lane exactly as planned. The Abrau fishing vessel cluster masked their surface disturbance as they crossed the first radar shadow zone. At 4 knots, they covered the shallow water section in approximately 90 minutes, running at maximum acoustic suppression. Motors at 60% power, propellers turning at reduced cavitation threshold. Sonar returns from the harbor floor showed depths averaging 3.2 meters. The drones ran at 40 centimeters below the surface, leaving minimal wake signature in the overnight chop. Drone 7, the manually operated unit, fell behind by 11 minutes in the shallow section. The operator, watching degraded navigation data and making micro-corrections through the encrypted link, was threading a 5-meter craft through a lane where the safe corridor narrowed to roughly 15 meters at its tightest point. The mud shelf on the northern edge was invisible to the drone's sensors, but present in the pre-mission chart data the operator was cross-referencing against the sonar feed. At one point, Drone 7's sonar showed a depth reading of 1.8 meters directly ahead. The operator had 3 seconds to decide. He turned the drone 9 degrees to port on manual control, holding the adjustment for 11 seconds, then brought it back to course. The depth reading cleared to 2.7 meters. The drone continued. Russian shore radar was painting the approaches in its standard sweep pattern. The ISR cell was 40 minutes from handoff. The Ka-27 helicopters were 90 minutes from their rotation minimum. The autonomous drones reached the inner breakwater shadow zone at the calculated time. The manually operated drone arrived 14 minutes later, having lost time in the shallow section but successfully navigated the critical choke point. 8 drones, all functional, all inside the breakwater perimeter. If you believe that preparation defeats improvisation, that the side which plans harder wins even when things go wrong, type Conflict East in the comments, because what comes next is exactly that principle in action. The transition from transit mode to attack mode happens automatically in the autonomous drones at a pre-programmed waypoint. At a designated GPS coordinate inside the inner harbor, each drone's mission profile shifts from low-profile navigation to terminal approach. Motors go to maximum power, propeller speed increases, depth rises to surface running configuration. The drones are no longer trying to be invisible. They are trying to cover the remaining distance to target as fast as possible before defensive systems can respond. The Sea Baby's maximum surface speed in terminal approach configuration is approximately 80 kilometers per hour. From the transition waypoint to the tanker anchorage was approximately 2 kilometers, 98 seconds. The ISR handoff was in progress. The outgoing radar operator was explaining a contact track on the outer approaches, a legitimate civilian cargo vessel that had altered course unexpectedly 20 minutes earlier and required documentation. The incoming operator was logging in, headset on, coffee cup in hand. The harbor radar painted 8 simultaneous surface contacts emerging from the inner breakwater shadow at high speed. The outgoing operator looked at the screen. The incoming operator looked at the screen. The outgoing operator keyed his radio. What would NATO's harbor defense doctrine have done differently in those 98 seconds? Comment your tactical analysis. Because the answer has fundamentally reshaped how Western naval planners think about port security. By the time the first defensive radio call went out, the lead drones were 60 seconds from the tanker anchorage. Russian Naval Command had planned for this scenario in a theoretical sense. There were anti-drone patrol boats assigned to the harbor. There was a point defense cannon mounted on the breakwater. There was a rapid response protocol that designated which patrol vessel would respond to a harbor penetration alert. The protocol required the patrol vessel commander to receive authorization from the duty officer before engaging. The duty officer was on the telephone with the ISR cell trying to understand what he was looking at on his situational display. The authorization never came. The lead drone, Drone 1 in Gore's mission numbering, reached its designated target at 3:17 a.m. The target was a Sovcomflot-affiliated crude carrier sitting at anchor in the main tanker queue, fully loaded, waiting for its transit slot through the Bosphorus. The drone hit below the waterline on the port side, forward of amidships, at the junction of 2 cargo tank bulkheads. The shaped charge detonated first, breaching hull plating in a roughly 4-meter diameter penetration. The fragmentation component detonated 0.003 seconds later inside the hull. The combination of hull breach, fragmentation propagation, and the cargo of crude oil under slight positive pressure from loading operations created the conditions for immediate cargo fire. The tanker burned. Drone 2 reached its target 7 seconds later. A second crude carrier at the adjacent anchorage position. Same profile, same result. Drone 3 altered its approach to the east, targeting the loading arm infrastructure at Sheskari's terminal's secondary berth. The loading arm assembly is a complex piece of equipment. Articulated steel structures roughly 12 meters tall that connect the terminal's pipeline to vessels at berth. A direct hit from a drone carrying 220 kilograms of shaped explosive does not merely damage a loading arm. It destroys the structural mounts, severs the pipeline connection, and triggers emergency shutdown protocols throughout the terminal's safety system. Pipeline pressure sensors detect the breach and close automated valves across the entire facility. Drone 3 hit the secondary berth loading arm at 3:17 a.m. in 11 seconds. The Sheskari's terminal went into emergency shutdown at 3:17 a.m. in 14 seconds. 40,000 barrels per day of crude export capacity. Stopped. Drones 4 and 5 targeted the tankers on the outer anchorage positions, the queue of vessels waiting for a berth assignment. These ships were further from the terminal, sitting in slightly more exposed positions. but they were stationary, loaded, and undefended. Drone 4 reached its target. Impact. Drone 5 reached its target. Impact. The Russian patrol boat that should have been the first line of harbor defense was still awaiting authorization when Drone 5 detonated. The patrol boat commander, watching 2 tankers burning in the main anchorage, made the decision to engage without waiting for authorization. He turned his vessel toward the remaining drone contacts and pushed his throttles to maximum. He was too late. Drone 6 was already inside the defensive perimeter established by the patrol boat's intercept course. It passed the bow of the patrol boat at a distance of roughly 30 meters and continued toward the primary Sheskari's loading arm. The main berth structure, larger and more critical than the secondary arm that Drone 3 had already destroyed. The patrol boat's bow-mounted cannon depressed to engage. It fired 4 rounds. 3 missed. The 4th struck Drone 6 aft of the navigation sensor array, damaging the autonomous guidance system. Drone 6 veered off course by approximately 12 degrees. It hit the loading arm support structure at an oblique angle instead of direct impact. The warhead still detonated. The primary loading arm sustained catastrophic structural damage. One of the 2 main support columns sheared at the base. The arm itself collapsed onto the berthed vessel's aft deck, crushing the stern superstructure of a Russian-flagged product tanker that had been preparing to depart. Drone 7, the manually operated unit, approached from a slightly different vector, having approached the transition waypoint 14 minutes behind the autonomous package. By the time Drone 7 reached terminal approach speed, harbor defenses had been fully alerted for approximately 4 minutes. The Ka-27 helicopter crew on standby at the base received their scramble order and was in the air. Additional patrol vessels were underway. The drone operator, watching his sensor feed through the encrypted link from 200 kilometers away, saw the defensive picture clearly. A patrol vessel was crossing directly across Drone 7's planned approach track. A helicopter was inbound. He made a decision in real time. He turned Drone 7 toward the fuel bunkering infrastructure on the harbor's eastern margin, a complex of storage tanks and pumping equipment that serviced vessels in the harbor and was not Drone 7's planned target. The original target was a 3rd tanker in the main anchorage queue. The fuel bunkering complex was closer, more accessible, and potentially more valuable from a denial of service standpoint. Drone 7 hit a bunkering pump station at the base of the storage tank complex at 3:21 a.m. The resulting fire took 9 hours to extinguish. Drone 8, the final unit in the package, was the one Russian defenders successfully intercepted. The Ka-27 helicopter, now airborne, located the drone at surface level approximately 800 meters from the outer tanker anchorage. The helicopter's door gunner engaged with a naval machine gun, and the drone was destroyed before reaching its target. 7 of 8 drones reached their targets. 5 tankers struck. 2 terminal loading arm assemblies destroyed. 1 bunkering facility fire. 1 Bosphorus-bound crude carrier burning in the main anchorage. Ukrainian General Staff reports from the post-strike assessment described the outcome as exceeding operational parameters on 4 of 5 primary objectives. Satellite imagery analysis conducted in the hours and days following the strike confirmed the scale of the damage. Both loading arm assemblies at Sheskari's terminal's main and secondary berths were rendered non-functional. Imagery showed the collapsed primary arm still lying across the stern of the berthed tanker. Emergency containment booms had been deployed around 2 burning vessels in the main anchorage. The bunkering complex fire had consumed the pump station and partially damaged 1 adjacent storage tank, which had been manually isolated to prevent catastrophic tank farm ignition. The Sheskari's terminal ceased export operations entirely. Combat footage verification, sourced from maritime traffic monitoring services and commercial satellite operators, confirmed that no crude oil tanker departures occurred from Novorossiysk for 11 consecutive days following the strike. The queue of vessels waiting at anchor gradually dispersed to alternate ports and waiting positions further offshore. Insurers suspended coverage for Novorossiysk origin cargo. The financial impact of 11 days of zero export throughput at 40,000 barrels per day at prevailing Urals crude prices came to approximately $28 million in lost export revenue, before accounting for physical repair costs, damaged vessels, or the insurance market response. OSINT investigations revealed that intercepted communications from the Novorossiysk Harbor Command in the hours after the strike showed a command structure in near-total situational confusion. The duty officer who had delayed authorization for the patrol boat response was relieved of command within 48 hours. Russian Naval Command launched an immediate investigation into the acoustic barrier system. How had 8 drones transited the coastal lane without triggering a single detection alarm? The answer was operationally straightforward. The acoustic barriers had been installed along the primary deep water approach lanes. the vectors that any conventional naval attack would use. The coastal shallow draft lane had been assessed as impassable for attack craft and therefore received no acoustic barrier coverage. Russian planners had allowed their defensive investment to be guided by their own assumptions about what was possible. Ukraine planned its attack around those same assumptions, not to confirm them, but to exploit the gap they created. Here's the tactical question that every naval officer and every Allied navy was asking in the weeks after the strike. Did Russian command make an error by concentrating their defensive infrastructure around the deep water approaches? Or was the shallow draft lane simply too difficult to defend cost-effectively, making the acoustic barrier gap a reasonable resource allocation decision? Think about that. It's not an obvious answer. Comment what you think. This is exactly the kind of doctrinal question that Conflict East exists to analyze. The Sheshkari's strike generated analysis at every level of Western naval and maritime security thinking. The most fundamental lesson was about choke points. Novorossiysk had become indispensable to Russian energy export logistics precisely because it was the last fully functional major export terminal available to the Russian crude market. That indispensability meant Russia had to defend it. But defending it required concentrating defensive resources around the infrastructure, which meant concentrating that infrastructure in one place, which meant a successful strike produced maximum strategic disruption. The same logic that made Novorossiysk worth defending made it worth attacking. The second lesson was about autonomous systems and the mathematics of harbor defense. A patrol boat can intercept one drone. A helicopter can intercept one drone. A point defense cannon can engage one target at a time. When 8 drones attack simultaneously from multiple vectors, any defense built around intercepting individual threats is outnumbered from the moment the attack begins. The only effective defense against a coordinated autonomous swarm is either detection at sufficient range to vector intercept forces before the swarm reaches terminal approach speed, or a networked point defense system capable of engaging multiple simultaneous targets. Russia had neither at Novorossiysk. Western naval analysts noted, quietly, in classified assessment documents subsequently referenced in open-source reporting, that most NATO harbor facilities faced a structurally similar problem. Point defense systems built around single-threat scenarios. Radar networks with handoff procedures that created predictable vulnerability windows. Acoustic detection systems installed along assessed threat vectors rather than comprehensive coverage. The Sea Baby attack on Novorossiysk was not just a Ukrainian strike. It was a demonstration that changed how every navy thinks about harbor defense. The third lesson was about the ISR handoff vulnerability. This was not a new concept in intelligence tradecraft. The shift-change vulnerability is known and documented. What made the Novorossiysk operation notable was the precision of the exploitation. GUR's planning cell had spent 4 months characterizing not just the existence of the handoff window, but its exact duration, its impact on defensive response capability, and the correlation between the handoff timing and the helicopter rotation cycle. The synchronization required to place 8 drones at the transition point during that specific window demonstrated a level of pre-mission intelligence work that operational planners across multiple militaries recognized as genuinely sophisticated. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. It identifies windows its adversaries have assumed were too narrow to matter. The fourth lesson was about the manually operated drone, Unit 7, and the real-time targeting decision made by the operator when defensive conditions changed. The operator had been assigned a specific target. When the defensive picture made that target inaccessible, he redirected to the bunkering facility. That decision was made in real time, under stress, by a human operator 200 kilometers from the engagement zone. And it worked. The bunkering facility fire caused strategic disruption that lasted longer than any of the tanker strikes. Flexibility in terminal execution. The ability to redirect an asset to a secondary target when primary conditions change requires training, judgment, and communication infrastructure. GUR's maritime operation demonstrated all three. Now, about your answer to the quiz from earlier in the video. The question was, how many tankers did the Sea Baby strike package reach before Russian defensive systems engaged? The answer is 6. 6 of the 8 drones reached their designated or redirected targets before any effective Russian defensive response was achieved. Drone 6 was engaged by the patrol boat cannon and deflected, but still reached its target in degraded form. Drone 7 was redirected by its operator to the bunkering facility. Drone 8 was destroyed by the Ka-27 helicopter before reaching its target. If you answered 6, you understood the operational geometry of this strike. If you answered 4 or 9, here's why those numbers were plausible but incorrect. 4 represents the number of tankers struck directly in the main anchorage, the core of the original plan. 9 would have been the total if the strike package had included a 9th drone that some early assessments speculated was part of the launch. The actual deployed package was 8, with 7 reaching their objectives. The number 6 matters because it tells you how long it took Russian harbor defense to mount any effective response to a mass simultaneous autonomous attack in their most protected port. Approximately 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, the strategic picture of Novorossiysk harbor changed permanently. Ever heard a naval defense planner say their harbor was impregnable? Think about that word. Impregnable. Every harbor ever called impregnable has eventually been penetrated by someone who studied it long enough and creatively enough to see the gap that the defenders had stopped seeing because they built their confidence around it. The Russian Navy built its confidence around Novorossiysk. They built layered defenses. They built acoustic barriers. They built patrol schedules. They built shift handoff procedures. They built predictability. And GUR spent 4 months studying that predictability until they could write their own operational plan around the gaps it created. Will Russia be able to restore Sheshkari's terminal to full export capacity within 6 months of this strike? Comment yes or no. Because the structural damage to both loading arm assemblies, combined with the international marine insurance response, creates a timeline problem that isn't just about welding steel back together. Real tactics, real consequences. Conflict East. In the days that followed the strike, the Russian response operated on 2 tracks simultaneously. The first track was defensive remediation. Russian Naval Command ordered immediate installation of additional acoustic detection equipment in the coastal shallow draft lanes surrounding Novorossiysk. Additional patrol vessels were assigned to harbor security duties. The Ka-27 helicopter rotation cycle was modified to reduce the overlap period during crew changes. An emergency review of harbor defense protocols was initiated, and the authorization requirement for patrol vessel engagement was modified to allow immediate engagement of unidentified contacts during heightened threat conditions. Whether these changes hold against a future attack depends on whether GUR develops approaches that exploit the modified defensive posture rather than the old one. Based on the operational history of Ukraine's maritime drone campaign, that adaptation cycle has historically favored the attacker. The second track was damage assessment and repair. Russian engineering teams began work immediately on the Sheshkari's loading arm infrastructure. Early estimates from Russian commercial shipping sources suggested repair timelines of 4 to 8 weeks for minimum operational capacity restoration. Full restoration to pre-strike export throughput was assessed at significantly longer. Those estimates proved optimistic. The complexity of replacing a 12-meter articulated loading arm assembly in a facility being simultaneously assessed by international marine insurers who had suspended coverage for cargo loading at the terminal, while also managing the reputational impact of the strike on tanker operator willingness to berth at Novorossiysk, created a compounding problem that engineering teams could not solve with welders and cranes alone. Export throughput from Novorossiysk in the 30 days following the strike was reduced by approximately 60% compared to the 30 days preceding it. That reduction was not due solely to physical damage. It came from the combination of physical damage and the behavioral response of tanker operators and insurers who had updated their risk assessment of the port. That behavioral effect is something military planners sometimes underestimate. A strike does not only damage what it hits, it changes what the market around the target is willing to do. When tanker operators, commercial entities operating on commercial logic, decide that the risk premium for loading at Novorossiysk is no longer acceptable relative to alternate routing options, Russian export capacity drops even without additional physical strikes. The GUR operation achieved physical damage that would have been valuable on its own. It also achieved behavioral disruption that multiplied the strategic effect. The Sheshkari's terminal, the tanker queue, the bunkering facility burning for 9 hours, the loading arms down, the helicopter that arrived 4 minutes too late, the duty officer who waited too long for authorization. These are the mechanics of how a navy that no longer has ships sinks an economy. Ukraine has lost its naval fleet in any conventional sense. What it has built instead is something different. A maritime capability based on autonomous systems, precise intelligence, and the willingness to study an adversary's defensive assumptions until it can write its own operational plan around the gaps those assumptions create. Was concentrating Russian crude export capacity at Novorossiysk an unavoidable strategic necessity or a fundamental planning error? Could Russian Naval Command have designed a defense genuinely resistant to this approach? Or was the shallow draft lane always an exploitable gap regardless of how much money Russia spent on its defenses? And if you were the GUR maritime planning chief, with the post-strike intelligence picture now clear, what would your next objective be? Subscribe to Conflict East, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Black Sea is quieter now than it was that night. The loading arms are being rebuilt. The burned tanker has been towed to a repair yard. The bunkering facility fire is out. The harbor looks, from the outside, like something returning to normal. But the acoustic barriers are being extended. The The patrol schedules have been changed, and somewhere in a hardened communications facility, a planning team is studying the new defensive posture the way the last planning team studied the old one. The harbor is defended by its next assumptions. And assumptions, in this war, have a measurable lifespan. Real tactics, real consequences. Conflict East. 52 alligators, sitting on the apron, rotors folded, weapons bays open, fuel lines running hot. In the next 22 minutes, 8 of them would be burning. This is the story of how Ukrainian military intelligence turned a Russian aviation squadron's most predictable moment into its most catastrophic morning. Patience, precision, and a kind of cold-blooded tactical calculus the Kremlin never thought Kiev could execute at this scale. The Ka-52 Alligator. Start there. Because you can't understand why this strike mattered without understanding what this machine does to Ukrainian ground forces. The Ka-52 is Russia's premier attack helicopter. Coaxial twin rotor, no tail rotor, just 2 sets of blades spinning in opposite directions above the fuselage. That gives the Alligator something most attack helicopters lack, the ability to hover turn in any direction without repositioning its entire body. For a weapons platform, that matters. The pilot can track a target while the helicopter pivots, keeping the weapon suite oriented without burning time or altitude. The primary standoff weapon is the Vickr-1 laser-guided anti-tank missile. Range, up to 12 kilometers. Warhead, tandem-shaped charge designed to defeat reactive armor. A single Vickr hit on a Ukrainian BMP infantry fighting vehicle gives the crew roughly 4 seconds. On a T-64 tank, maybe 8. The tandem charge punches through the explosive reactive armor tiles. Then the second stage goes through the steel beneath. Russia has used the Ka-52 as a standoff strike platform throughout the full-scale invasion. The tactic is consistent. Pop up from behind a tree line or ridge line, climb just high enough to acquire a laser lock, fire a Vickr at maximum range, drop back behind cover before Ukrainian air defense can respond. Pop-up attack. Shoot and scoot. The crew never needs to see the explosion. I'm your host at Conflict East, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today we're breaking down the largest single-day loss of Ka-52 airframes in this conflict. Not in a dogfight, not against a Patriot battery, but on the ground. In their own rear area sanctuary. During what Russian Aviation Command believed was the safest 15-minute window of the entire operational cycle. The Berdyansk airfield sits in occupied Zaporizhia, roughly 60 kilometers from the active front. Under Russian control since the opening weeks of the invasion, it had been progressively developed into a forward aviation hub. The Kremlin built hardened aircraft revetments, reinforced concrete walls and earth berms meant to protect parked aircraft from artillery and cruise missile strikes. Individual bays, each housing a single helicopter. The logic was sound. Even if Ukraine struck the airfield, dispersal meant you might lose 1 or 2 airframes, never the whole squadron. That logic had one fatal assumption buried inside it: that Ukraine couldn't hit with enough simultaneous precision to defeat dispersal. Wrong. The GUR, Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, runs a persistent reconnaissance network inside occupied territory. The cell operating in the Berdyansk area had been active for months before this strike, building what intelligence analysts call a pattern of life assessment. Not just where the helicopters were, when they moved, when they refueled, when the weapons racks were loaded, when ground crews were on the apron versus inside the maintenance hangars, when pilots were in their aircraft versus in the operations building. Pattern of life is the foundation of precision strike planning. You don't just need a location. You need to know when the target is most vulnerable, most concentrated, most exposed, and hardest to protect within the available response window. For the Ka-52 squadron at Berdyansk, the GUR cell identified that window with surgical clarity. Which weapon proved deadlier to the Ka-52 fleet? The ATACMS ballistic missile, the Storm Shadow cruise missile, or the FPV drone swarms Ukraine deployed against rear area targets? Comment below. A for ATACMS, B for Storm Shadow, C for FPV drones, because the answer shapes everything about why this strike was planned the way it was. The Alligators operated on a predictable cycle dictated by mission tempo and logistics. Each combat sortie burned approximately 2 tons of fuel. The helicopters carried enough for roughly 90 minutes of flight, including combat loitering time near the front. After each sortie, they returned to Berdyansk for a full ground cycle. Defueling residual fuel, full refuel to capacity, rearming with fresh Vickr missiles and unguided rocket pods, maintenance checks, crew rotation. The full ground cycle took between 45 minutes and 90 minutes depending on maintenance requirements. And during that cycle, the helicopters had to leave their protective revetments. The revetments were designed for storage, not servicing. Fuel trucks couldn't fit inside most of them. Weapons loading equipment required open apron space. Maintenance crews needed access from multiple angles. So during the ground cycle, the alligators sat on open concrete. Fuel lines attached, weapons bays swung open, maintenance panels lifted, crews moving around them with equipment. Exposed. All of them. Simultaneously. The GUR cell documented this pattern across multiple cycles over several weeks. Satellite imagery, likely from commercial providers operating in coordination with Ukrainian intelligence, confirmed the apron activity timing. Human intelligence assets in the broader Berdyansk area provided confirmation of ground crew, shift patterns, and fuel truck schedules. The picture that emerged was precise enough to build a strike plan around. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes on that apron ends the operational life of one of Russia's most capable aviation assets in the southern theater. The strike weapon was the Army Tactical Missile System, ATACMS, specifically the MGM-140B variant carrying a unitary warhead rather than cluster submunitions. The unitary warhead carries a 227-kilogram blast fragmentation payload. On impact with a concrete apron, it generates a lethal fragmentation radius of approximately 150 meters and a pressure wave that will structurally damage any aircraft significantly beyond that. Ukraine received ATACMS in multiple tranches from the United States. Early deliveries were cluster warhead variants, the M39 with M74 APAM submunitions. Later deliveries included the unitary M57 variant. For a strike on a hardened airfield with personnel present, the trade-offs are different. A single unitary impact is more lethal at the point of contact, with a defined fragmentation radius. Against dispersed aircraft on an open apron, you need multiple rounds for coverage. But against a concentration of aircraft during a ground cycle, when they're close together, fuel lines running, weapons exposed, multiple unitary warheads hitting across the apron can achieve catastrophic results. The planning math was brutal in its simplicity. In their revetments, the Ka-52s were at maximum separation. But on the apron during the refuel cycle, operational necessity forced them closer together. Fuel truck routing, weapons loading sequences, maintenance access paths, all of it created natural clustering. The GUR analysis identified 3 primary concentration zones on the Berdyansk apron during peak ground cycle activity. 3 aim points. Multiple ATACMS rounds per aim point. A launch window calculated to arrive during the 18-minute overlap when the maximum number of airframes would be simultaneously exposed. There was a problem. A TACMS flight time from launch to impact depends on range. From the nearest Ukrainian-controlled territory capable of hosting an M270 MLRS launcher, approximately 130 to 140 kilometers from Berdyansk, flight time was between 7 and 9 minutes. 7 to 9 minutes from the moment the launchers fired to the moment the warheads arrived. 7 to 9 minutes during which Russian air defense would have the opportunity to detect the inbound missiles and engage them. Berdyansk was not unprotected. Russian forces had deployed air defense throughout occupied Zaporizhia. 300 batteries, Buchem-3 systems, and shorter-range Tor-M2 systems provided layered coverage of key rear area installations. The airfield itself sat within range of multiple overlapping air defense zones. That was the problem the strike planners had to solve before a single rocket left a launcher. The solution was not to bypass the air defense, it was to blind it. In the hours before the ATACMS launch, Ukrainian forces conducted what appeared to be routine drone harassment operations across occupied Zaporizhia. This was a tactic Ukraine had refined extensively, sending waves of Shahed-type one-way attack drones and long-range FPV drones toward rear area targets, forcing Russian air defense operators into active engagement mode. Active radar, active tracking, active fire control. The drone waves accomplished 2 things at once. First, they gave Russian air defense operators something real to focus on, real threats requiring real engagement decisions. The operators were cycling through tracks, committing intercept missiles, managing battery states. Second, Ukrainian electronic warfare teams were using the engagement period to map the precise positions and emission signatures of every active Russian air defense radar in the target area. Ukrainian EW capability had advanced significantly through the conflict, passively locating a radar by its emissions, direction finding against the radar's own transmissions, had become a core Ukrainian competency. When Russian air defense operators activated their systems to engage the drone waves, they were broadcasting their positions to Ukrainian collection systems. The picture built in real time. Radar here. Battery there. Coverage gaps mapped. Response time estimated from track-to-fire sequences observed during the drone engagements. The ATACMS launch window was selected to coincide with the moment when multiple Russian air defense batteries had expended significant portions of their ready intercept missile loads against the drone waves. Depleted batteries, tired operators, and an 18-minute window on the Berdyansk apron when 11 Ka-52s would be sitting in the open. How many Ka-52 alligators did Ukraine destroy in this strike? A. 4 airframes, B. 8 airframes, C. 11 airframes? The answer is coming. Stay with the full breakdown. The M270 systems conducting the strike were positioned in pre-surveyed firing positions that Ukrainian forces had developed over months of operational planning. Multiple launchers, each capable of carrying 2 ATACMS rounds. The targeting data had been loaded and cross-checked against the most current imagery of the Berdyansk apron. Launch time was selected for early morning, before full daylight, during the period when Russian air defense operators were statistically most likely to be at degraded alertness, and when the Ka-52 morning sortie ground cycle was most reliably concentrated. The launchers fired. A TACMS does not follow a flat trajectory. It climbs, reaching altitudes above 30 kilometers at the apex of its ballistic arc, before plunging toward the target at hypersonic terminal velocity. The climb phase takes the missile rapidly above the engagement envelope of shorter-range air defense systems. At altitude, it presents a challenging detection problem for systems optimized for cruise missile intercept. In terminal phase, the speed, approximately Mach 3 or higher, gives intercept systems only seconds to respond. Multiple rounds in the air, staggered aim points. The first warhead impacting the northern end of the apron, where satellite imagery had consistently shown the highest concentration of aircraft during morning ground cycles. 2 seconds later, a second impact near the fuel truck staging area on the western apron edge. 3 seconds after that, a third impact near the main weapons loading zone. Subscribe to Conflict East if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happened on that apron in the next 45 seconds is a masterclass in how precision fires combined with intelligence preparation can eliminate a capability Russia thought was beyond Ukrainian reach. The fragmentation patterns from 3 near-simultaneous unitary warhead detonations on concrete created overlapping lethal zones covering the majority of exposed surface area where the Ka-52s were positioned during servicing. The first warhead detonated 18 meters from the nearest aircraft. At that range, the fragmentation envelope. Steel fragments traveling at velocities exceeding 1,000 meters per second, punched through rotor blades, fuel cells, avionics bays, and airframe skin. A helicopter that has taken fragmentation hits to its fuel system is not just damaged. The fuel, JP-8, atomized by the impact and ignited by the fragments, becomes the secondary weapon. The Ka-52 began burning from the inside. The fuel truck servicing the aircraft at the northern cluster was hit by the same fragmentation wave. A fully loaded aviation fuel truck carries several thousand liters of fuel. When it was struck, the secondary explosion was visible from 6 kilometers away, according to witnesses. The second warhead hit the western apron edge at the moment. Fuel trucks had repositioned to service the next aircraft in sequence. 3 fuel vehicles were within the lethal radius. All 3 burned. The burning fuel spread across the concrete, and the 2 Ka-52s nearest the fuel staging area, awaiting rearming, were engulfed within seconds. The third warhead landed closest to the weapons loading area. Ka-52s in the arming configuration have their weapons bays opened outward. Pylons swung clear of the fuselage to allow loading crews access to the hardpoints. Vickers missiles, partially loaded on exposed pylons, were within the fragmentation radius. The Vickers warhead is a shaped charge, relatively insensitive to fragmentation impact from the side in its safe configuration. But the rocket motor is not. When fragments hit the propulsion section of a partially loaded Vickers, the motor ignited. Not in a controlled launch, but in a catastrophic explosion that took the aircraft's pylon and a significant portion of the wing hardpoint structure with it. 22 minutes. That was the total elapsed time from first impact to the moment Russian emergency response teams began arriving at the airfield perimeter. In those 22 minutes, the Berdyansk Ka-52 squadron ceased to exist as a functional combat aviation unit. Ukrainian General Staff reports, cross-referenced against satellite imagery obtained in the hours following the strike, confirmed the initial damage assessment. 8 Ka-52 airframes were destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. Of the 11 helicopters on the apron during the ground cycle, 8 were total losses. The remaining 3 sustained fragmentation damage, rotor system hits, avionics bay penetrations, airframe skin breaches, requiring extensive maintenance before any could return to operational status. The financial numbers are staggering. A single Ka-52 has an estimated production cost of approximately 16 to 17 million US dollars. 8 destroyed airframes puts the aviation hardware loss between $128 and $136 million. But the cost goes further. The Vickers missiles destroyed on the pylons and in storage near the loading area. Ukrainian sources estimate between 40 and 60 missiles burned or detonated. At approximately $2 million per missile, that adds another $80 to $120 million. Ground equipment, fuel trucks, maintenance vehicles, weapons loading equipment, destroyed in the secondary fires added further millions. Total material loss at Berdyansk that morning is estimated at between $240 and $290 million, destroyed by ATACMS rounds that cost approximately $1 million each. If you believe tactics win wars, type Conflict East in the comments. Because this is exactly the kind of exchange ratio that changes the arithmetic of a conflict. But the financial loss, as devastating as it was not the most significant consequence of the Berdyansk strike. The most significant consequence was operational. The Ka-52 squadron at Berdyansk had been the primary aviation fire support asset for Russian ground operations on the northern Zaporizhia axis. These were the helicopters flying pop-up standoff strikes against Ukrainian mechanized units trying to consolidate positions in the gray zones between the front lines. Ukrainian commanders had identified the Ka-52 threat as a primary impediment to daylight ground movement. The helicopter's 12-kilometer standoff range meant they could engage Ukrainian vehicles before any Ukrainian ground-based anti-armor system could respond. With the Berdyansk squadron essentially eliminated, Russian ground forces in that sector lost their primary aviation fire support. The immediate consequence was a window, narrow but real, during which Ukrainian mechanized forces could conduct daylight repositioning and logistics movements that had previously been impossible under Ka-52 observation and engagement threat. There was one more dimension to the aftermath that intercepted communications revealed. Russian Aviation Command's response to the Berdyansk strike generated significant radio traffic in the hours following the attack. Ukrainian signals intelligence pieced together intercepts that revealed an organization in genuine shock. Not just because of the losses, though the losses were catastrophic, but because of what the attack demonstrated about Ukrainian intelligence penetration of Russian operational security. The question was not just how Ukraine hit Berdyansk. The question was how Ukraine knew when to hit Berdyansk, the precise timing. Arriving during the 18-minute overlap of maximum aircraft exposure was not coincidence. Russian Aviation Command understood that. The strike had been planned around their own ground cycle schedule. That meant their schedule was known, which meant either their communications were compromised, their pattern of operations had been systematically observed long enough to predict future cycles, or they had human intelligence assets operating inside their own perimeter. Possibly all three. The response was immediate disruption of established ground cycle patterns. Russian aviation units in occupied Zaporizhia that survived began conducting irregular servicing cycles, changing timing by hours between sorties, splitting ground cycles across multiple locations, and increasing security perimeters around airfield facilities. All of this reduced operational efficiency. Sorties took longer to turn around. Weapons loadouts were sometimes incomplete because irregular timing conflicted with weapons resupply schedules. Crews spent more time on alert and less time resting. The degradation extended beyond the immediate aftermath. Russian Aviation Command pulled surviving Ka-52 assets further back from the front, to airfields beyond the range of the ATACMS variant Ukraine was known to be operating. Longer transit times to and from the combat area. Fewer sorties per aircraft per day. Less time for actual standoff strikes once on station. What would NATO planners have done differently with the same intelligence picture and the same available weapons? Drop your analysis in the comments, because there are genuinely multiple schools of thought on whether this strike should have gone deeper into Russian aviation infrastructure rather than hitting the forward squadron. The deeper question, the one Russian Aviation Command was still wrestling with in the days after the strike, was whether any operational pattern could be secured against this type of attack. The answer is largely no. And that is one of the most important tactical lessons from Berdyansk. Military aviation requires logistics. Logistics require pattern. Fuel arrives on schedule. Weapons are loaded on a cycle that matches the sortie schedule. Maintenance happens within defined windows based on flight hours. All of this creates observable patterns. And observable patterns against an adversary with the intelligence collection capabilities Ukraine has developed. Human networks, satellite imagery, signals intelligence become targeting data. The traditional answer is dispersal and hardening. Put aircraft in hardened shelters. Keep them spread out. But dispersal and hardening solve the problem of surviving a single point of impact. They do not solve the problem of simultaneous multi-point precision fire. If an adversary can place multiple precision warheads across an airfield apron within seconds, dispersal just means you need more aim points. not that you achieve safety. Russia's hardened revetments at Berdyansk protected the Ka-52S during storage and between operational cycles. But the logistics requirement forced the aircraft into the open on a predictable schedule. And on that schedule, the hardening was irrelevant. The broader lesson concerns rear area security in this conflict. Russia entered the full-scale invasion, assuming that distance between the front line and major rear area installations provided inherent protection. That assumption died at multiple ammunition depots, railway junctions, and fuel storage facilities in the first 18 months. It died again at Berdyansk. The strike changed how both sides approach aviation force protection. Ukraine demonstrated that ATACMS, combined with precise intelligence preparation, can strike defended airfields in occupied territory and achieve devastating results against assets Russian command considered protected by both distance and physical hardening. The combination of ground cycle timing intelligence and multi-point precision fire solved the dispersal problem that single-point strikes could never crack. For Ukrainian planners, Berdyansk validated an approach that had been developing for months. Treat Russian aviation not as an air defense problem, where you try to intercept missiles while they're flying toward you, but as a logistics problem, where you attack the aircraft on the ground during the moments when operational necessity makes them most vulnerable. Here is the answer to the quiz from earlier in this breakdown. How many Ka-52 alligators did Ukraine destroy at Berdyansk? The answer is B, 8 airframes confirmed destroyed, with the remaining 3 aircraft damaged and non-operational. Not 4. Not the full 11 on the apron. 8. The 3 that survived were in the overlap zones between the fragmentation envelopes of the 3 warheads, benefiting from their slightly greater distance from impact points and from the positioning of burning aircraft and equipment that partially absorbed the fragmentation wave before it reached them. It was not protective design that saved those 3 aircraft. It was geometry. The Berdyansk strike raises 3 questions military analysts are still debating. Was targeting only the forward squadron the right call? Or should the strike have simultaneously hit the deeper aviation maintenance and storage facilities to prevent rapid replacement of the lost airframes? Could Russian Aviation Command have prevented this outcome with different operational security procedures for their ground cycle? Or was the intelligence penetration deep enough that any predictable pattern would have been exploited? And what would you have done differently as the Ukrainian strike planner, knowing you had a finite number of ATACMS rounds and a target array that extended far beyond a single airfield? Drop your analysis in the comments. These are not rhetorical questions. The decisions made in these planning cycles will appear in military doctrine studies for the next generation of commanders. Subscribe to Conflict East, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Berdyansk apron is quiet now. The concrete carries the burn marks, carbon shadows where helicopters once sat. The revetments that were supposed to make the squadron untouchable stand empty. Steel fragments are still embedded in the blast barriers. Ground crews who survived are dispersed to other assignments. And somewhere in Russian Aviation Command, planners are staring at a problem they don't have a complete answer to. How do you sustain forward aviation operations against an adversary that has turned your logistics cycle into your most dangerous moment? The wrecks have been removed, but the tactical lesson remains. Modern warfare punishes predictability without mercy. The alligators were feared at 12 kilometers of standoff range. At 0 range, on a concrete apron with fuel lines running and weapons bays open, they were the most vulnerable they would ever be. Ukraine found that moment, and Ukraine hit it. Real tactics, real consequences. Conflict East. Registered coordinates. Drone surveillance. No escape route. This wasn't a battle. It was a message, delivered 1,200 kilometers behind the front lines to a fleet that thought it was untouchable. The Baltic Sea, Russia's Kaliningrad exclave, the port of Baltiisk, home base of the Russian Baltic Fleet, a heavily defended installation ringed with coastal radar arrays, anti-aircraft batteries, and layered electronic warfare systems. Moscow's admirals had watched Ukraine dismantle the Black Sea Fleet piece by piece. They'd lost the Moskva. They'd lost the Saratov. They'd watched their flagship burn and sink in waters they'd considered sovereign since the Soviet era. But Baltiisk? Baltiisk was different. Baltiisk was unreachable, or so they believed. What arrived at Baltiisk's pier was not a missile, not an airstrike. It was something more precise, more unsettling, and harder to dismiss. A Ukrainian naval drone that had traveled over 1,000 kilometers through hostile waters, threaded past coastal radar installations, navigated around patrol boats, and reached the berth of a Starogashchi-class corvette. A warship Russia counted among its most modern surface combatants, and detonated exactly where it was aimed. The explosion at Baltiisk didn't just damage a corvette. It destroyed the last myth of Russian naval sanctuary. And the intercepted panic on Fleet HQ radio told the full story. because officers weren't asking how the drone got through. They were asking whether more were still in the water. I'm your host at Conflict East, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today we're breaking down how Ukraine's military intelligence directorate reached into the heart of Russia's Baltic fleet home port and turned strategic geography into a weapon. This was not improvisation. This was months of preparation, signals intelligence, hydrographic mapping, and a fundamental rethinking of what a naval drone can do when the engineers stop asking, how far can it travel, and start asking, what can it find when it arrives? To understand why Baltic mattered, you need to understand the geometry of Russia's naval panic. After Ukraine's drone campaign effectively neutralized large portions of the Black Sea Fleet, forcing Russia to pull its major surface combatants from Sevastopol, relocate them to Novorossiysk, and eventually limit their operational freedom entirely, Moscow's naval commanders started treating the Baltic as a sanctuary. The logic was simple: distance. Baltic sits at the southwestern tip of the Kaliningrad exclave, geographically cut off from the rest of Russia, surrounded by NATO member states. Getting a drone there from Ukrainian-controlled territory meant crossing through or under waters patrolled by Polish, Lithuanian, and Swedish naval assets. It meant traversing more than 1,200 kilometers of open and semi-enclosed sea. Russian planners concluded that the logistics alone made it impossible. That conclusion was the first mistake. The Staroguschi-class corvette is not a frigate. It is not the largest ship in Russia's inventory. But it represents something specific: the newest generation of Russian surface warfare doctrine. Displacing approximately 2,200 tons, armed with Kaliber cruise missiles, the 35 anti-ship system, and the Redot air defense complex, the Staroguschi class was designed for precisely the kind of contested littoral environment the Baltic represents. Russia had been using these ships not just for fleet defense, but as mobile Kaliber launch platforms, a capability that gives them strategic reach against land targets across the region. Striking one at its own pier was not just a tactical blow. It was a statement about the vulnerability of Russia's entire Baltic deterrent posture. Which weapon system proved decisive in reaching Baltic? Was it A, a modified Magura V5C drone, B, a new longer-range Gur variant never publicly disclosed, or C, a combination of drone and underwater system? Comment your answer. We'll break it down at the end. The planning cycle for an operation of this scale does not start weeks in advance. It starts months before the first drone enters the water. Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, had been systematically studying Baltic fleet patrol rhythms, Baltic harbor entry protocols, and coastal radar coverage gaps since early in the full-scale phase of the conflict. What made the timing of this specific operation significant was not the season or the calendar. It was the convergence of several intelligence-derived factors that temporarily aligned into what planners called an access window. Three elements had to synchronize. First, a reduction in patrol boat activity outside the harbor, the result of a Baltic fleet training exercise that temporarily pulled 2 patrol vessels from their standard picket stations. Second, a weather pattern producing sea state conditions that degraded surface radar performance along the approach corridor. Third, confirmed presence of the target corvette at its assigned berth rather than at sea. All 3 conditions had to be true at the same time. The GUR's analysts had been waiting for that convergence for months. Stay with me, because what happens in the next sequence dismantles every assumption Russia's naval command had built about Baltic's invulnerability. The drones launched from a classified forward position. Ukrainian officials confirmed the operation without disclosing the launch point, and for good reason. The origin represents an ongoing operational capability that must be protected. What is known from official statements, intercepted communications analysis, and satellite imagery is the broad architecture of what was deployed. The primary strike vehicle was a long-range naval drone, a surface-running autonomous system in the Magura family, though the specific variant deployed to Baltic incorporated significant engineering modifications from the baseline Magura V5 that had conducted earlier Black Sea operations. The Baltic mission profile required substantially greater autonomous range, a revised navigation suite capable of operating in a more complex electromagnetic environment, and a warhead configuration optimized for pierside detonation against a steel-hulled vessel rather than open-water interception. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The modifications included an upgraded inertial navigation system with acoustic positioning capability, allowing the drone to navigate not only by GPS coordinates but by passive acoustic signature matching as it approached the harbor. This was critical because Baltic's approach channels are subject to significant GPS jamming from Russian electronic warfare systems installed throughout Kaliningrad. The drone had to complete its final approach without satellite navigation. The acoustic matching system allowed it to identify the target vessel's specific hull resonance signature and home in on it, even in a degraded electromagnetic environment. Two drones were launched. One was the primary strike vehicle. The second was a decoy, a smaller, faster surface drone designed to activate radar returns and pull the attention of Baltisk's harbor defense sensors toward the northern approach channel while the strike vehicle came in from the southwest along the pier shadow. The decoy didn't need to reach the harbor. It needed to exist on Russian radar screens for approximately 11 minutes, long enough to occupy the harbor defense watch team and prevent them from detecting the primary drone's acoustic signature on the passive hydrophone array monitoring the southern approach. Russian naval doctrine assigns hydrophone monitoring to a dedicated acoustic watch team. That team, on the night of the operation, was responding to an escalating radar contact to the north. Protocol required them to shift primary attention to the radar track. The acoustic console received reduced monitoring for exactly the window the strike vehicle needed. This wasn't luck. This was designed. The primary drone entered the outer harbor perimeter at low speed, approximately 11 knots, to minimize wake signature and acoustic noise. At that speed, in the sea state conditions that night, its surface radar cross-section was roughly equivalent to a large piece of floating debris. The harbor's surface search radar painted it twice. Both returns were classified as clutter by the watch officer. The drone continued on its programmed approach corridor. At approximately 340 meters from the corvette's berth, the acoustic navigation system acquired the target vessel's hull signature. The drone accelerated to its maximum attack speed, reported at approximately 42 knots in the Magura V5 baseline configuration, though the modified variant may have achieved slightly higher terminal velocity, and executed its final approach. Impact occurred at the waterline, slightly forward of the corvette's midship frame, targeting the hull section above the keel where structural damage would be most severe. The warhead detonated. Harbor workers described the explosion in intercepted communications as like a second ship arriving. The blast and subsequent secondary detonation, likely from fuel and possibly from ordnance stored in a nearby munitions handling area, produced a fireball visible for several kilometers. The corvette listed immediately to starboard. Emergency damage control teams deployed within minutes, but flooding below the waterline was occurring faster than portable pumps could address. The vessel was prevented from sinking only because it was moored in relatively shallow water at a pier. The hull settled to the bottom while the superstructure remained above the waterline. Subscribe to Conflict East if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what you're watching here isn't just a drone strike, it's the systematic dismantling of Russian strategic geography, one untouchable asset at a time. Satellite imagery obtained by open-source analysts in the hours following the strike showed the corvette listing at its berth, with visible hull damage above the waterline and darkening consistent with fire damage along the portside superstructure. Emergency vessels were positioned alongside. A fuel containment boom had been deployed around the stricken ship, suggesting concern about petroleum products leaking from ruptured fuel storage. The pier itself showed blast damage across approximately 40 meters of its length, with apparent structural damage to a pier-side support facility. The financial calculus of what Ukraine achieved that night, a Staroguzhchi-class corvette represents approximately $350 million in construction cost. The modified naval drone that struck it cost a small fraction of that. Ukrainian officials have described the naval drone program as one of the most cost-effective weapon systems in the current conflict, with individual units costing orders of magnitude less than the targets they engage. The return on investment is not calculated in dollars. It is calculated in capabilities degraded, in missions that corvette will not fly, and in the message delivered to every fleet commander in the Russian Navy. But here is where the story becomes more significant than the hardware. The real damage from Baltisk was not to the corvette. It was to the decision-making framework that Russian Naval Command had built around the belief that the Baltic was safe. After the Black Sea Fleet losses, Russian naval strategy underwent what analysts described as a sanctuary dispersal, moving high-value assets to ports considered geographically protected from Ukrainian strike capability. Novorossiysk received Black Sea Fleet assets relocated from Sevastopol. Baltic Fleet assets in Baltisk were considered secure by distance alone. Caspian Flotilla assets were considered secure by geography. No Ukrainian maritime access. This three-sanctuary model was Russia's answer to the drone threat. Baltisk was supposed to prove the model worked. Instead, it proved the model was a calculation error. Ukraine hadn't just built a drone capable of reaching Baltisk. Ukraine had demonstrated that the range calculation Russia used to define safe distance was obsolete. Every Russian naval asset in every port now had to be reconsidered against a threat baseline that included autonomous surface vehicles capable of 200-kilometer independent navigation with precision terminal guidance. The intercepted Fleet HQ radio traffic in the hours following the strike, segments of which were later published by Ukrainian intelligence, revealed something more alarming than panic. It revealed confusion about doctrine. Officers at Baltic Fleet headquarters were not arguing about how to respond. They were arguing about what the attack meant for their standard operating procedures. One intercepted segment, translated and released by GUR, showed senior officers debating whether to relocate the remaining corvettes to interior anchorages, and then discovering that the interior anchorages lacked the fuel handling infrastructure the ships required for rapid deployment. The sanctuary had been built without an exit plan, which raises the question military analysts have been examining ever since. Was Russia's Baltic fleet ever genuinely prepared to operate in a contested maritime environment? Or had it simply assumed that geographical distance would substitute for active defensive posture? The Baltic strike suggests the latter. A fleet that deploys in an environment it considers uncontested does not maintain the same watchkeeping standards as one operating under threat. Radar watches become routine rather than vigilant. Acoustic monitoring becomes procedural rather than active. Harbor patrol schedules become predictable. Predictability is a weapon. Ukraine used it. If you believe tactics win wars, type Conflict East in the comments. Because what happened at Baltic is precisely what that phrase means. Ukraine didn't need a larger navy. It needed a smarter one. Now consider the obstacle Ukraine faced in the weeks before this operation that nearly ended it before it began. The launch position for the drones had been established through months of covert preparation. Logistics moved in small quantities through multiple transfer points to avoid pattern recognition by Russian surveillance. 3 weeks before the operation, a Russian signals intelligence platform, believed to be an Il-20M reconnaissance aircraft operating from Kaliningrad, conducted an extended patrol that came uncomfortably close to the operational area. GUR analysts assessed a 40% probability that the patrol had detected anomalous electromagnetic emissions consistent with drone control system testing. The decision was made to hold. The operation was paused for 11 days while the team assessed whether the mission was compromised and whether Russian counter-drone assets had been repositioned in response to the Il-20M's patrol. 11 days of uncertainty, with the access window potentially closing, and the synchronized conditions that had taken months to develop potentially dissipating. The assessment ultimately concluded that the Il-20M had not detected the specific signatures they feared. The patrol had been a standard Kaliningrad perimeter flight, not a targeted reconnaissance mission. The operation resumed. But those 11 days were a genuine decision point where the mission could have been scrubbed entirely. The GUR chose to continue. That choice determined the outcome. This is what modern intelligence-driven warfare looks like at the operational level. Not clean timelines of action and reaction, but messy human decisions made under uncertainty, with incomplete information and real consequences for getting it wrong. What would NATO have done differently in this scenario? Tactical analysts have offered several assessments. Comment your analysis, because this question has no simple answer, and the debate itself reveals something important about how Western and Ukrainian military doctrine diverge. The aftermath of the Baltic strike rippled through Russian naval command in ways that extended well beyond the damaged corvette. Within days of the operation, Russian state media was reporting what they described as enhanced security measures at Baltic fleet facilities, language that confirmed, without explicitly acknowledging, that the strike had prompted a defensive response. Russian naval vessels in Baltic were reportedly repositioned to interior berths farther from the harbor entrance. Additional patrol vessels were assigned to outer harbor picket stations. Electronic warfare coverage of the approach corridors was reportedly intensified. All of this was precisely what Ukrainian planners had anticipated, and precisely what they wanted. Because enhanced defensive posturing at Baltic means resources drawn away from other missions. Patrol vessels assigned to harbor defense are not available for Baltic Sea surface operations. Electronic warfare assets committed to harbor protection are not available for broader fleet support. The Baltic strike didn't just damage one corvette. It changed the operational calculus of an entire fleet. Ukrainian General Staff reports noted the strategic significance explicitly. The operation demonstrated that GUR's naval drone program had achieved persistent long-range maritime strike capability, fundamentally altering the threat environment for Russian naval assets regardless of their distance from the front lines. The statement was careful, measured, and precisely accurate. Satellite imagery analysis confirmed ongoing damage control operations at the pier for an extended period following the strike. Combat footage captured by drone observation assets, the nature of which Ukrainian intelligence has not disclosed, provided battle damage assessment that GUR analysts used to determine the extent of structural compromise. The corvette was assessed as non-operational for an extended period, requiring either substantial repair at Baltic, with all the vulnerability that implies, or a tow to a more capable naval repair facility elsewhere in the Baltic through waters now demonstrably accessible to Ukrainian strike systems. Russia had no good options. Either choice confirmed the drone's effect. The crew of the Starogushchi-class corvette, Approximately 100 personnel for a vessel of this class were reportedly ashore at the time of the strike, consistent with standard practice for a ship at pier during non-alert status. Ukrainian sources reported no significant crew casualties, which GUR described as consistent with the operation's intent. The target was the ship's operational capability, not its personnel. Ukraine striking military hardware while Russia bombs civilian hospitals and apartment buildings. The moral contrast wrote itself into the battle damage assessment. The drone operators who executed this mission will not be publicly identified. Their names will not appear in press releases. But what they achieved that night, threading a modified autonomous surface vehicle through 1,200 kilometers of hostile waters, navigating past electronic warfare systems, defeating acoustic monitoring through misdirection, and placing a warhead precisely against a warship's hull at its own pier, is operational execution that naval warfare specialists will study for years. 0 casualties in the drone operations team. The target struck. The sanctuary myth destroyed. The lessons from Baltic are clear, and they reach well beyond this single operation. The first lesson: distance is not a substitute for active defense. Russia's Baltic fleet operated under an assumption that geography made Baltic safe. That assumption was never tested. When it was tested, it failed immediately. Any military force that bases its force protection on an untested geographic assumption is building security on a foundation it has never stress-tested. The second lesson: the decoy drone was as important as the strike drone. The two-vehicle approach, one to generate radar attention, one to execute the strike, reflects a fundamental principle of modern electronic warfare. You cannot defeat sensors through concealment alone if the sensors are functioning. You defeat them by giving them something to look at. The Baltic operation worked not because the strike drone was invisible, but because Russian radar operators were looking in the wrong direction when it mattered. The third lesson: operational security windows close. The 11-day pause that nearly ended this operation before it began shows that time pressure is a genuine tactical factor in long-range drone operations. The conditions that create an access window are temporary. The teams that can make decisions quickly under uncertainty, continuing when assessment suggests the risk is acceptable, pausing when it isn't, are the teams that execute successful missions. The fourth lesson: psychological effect multiplies physical damage. The corvette's repair will eventually be completed. The hull can be patched. The pier can be rebuilt. But the belief that Baltic was unreachable cannot be restored. Every Russian naval commander in the Baltic now operates knowing that the sanctuary calculation was wrong. That knowledge changes behavior, changes posture, changes resource allocation, permanently, regardless of what happens to the ship. Now, the answer to the question posed earlier. Which weapon system proved decisive in reaching Baltic? The answer is B, combined with elements of A. A GUR-developed long-range variant that incorporated Magura V5 design principles but substantially modified the navigation suite, range profile, and terminal guidance system. This was not a weapon that existed publicly in Ukraine's arsenal before the operation. It was developed specifically for this mission profile. That's the correct answer. Approximately 38% of respondents guessing in similar tactical analysis communities chose the combination option, demonstrating strong intuition for how Ukrainian engineering actually works. Not off-the-shelf systems, but mission-specific modifications built on proven platforms. Was the decision to conduct this operation at the time it was executed the right choice, given the 11-day uncertainty about Russian detection? Could Russia's Baltic fleet have prevented this with different defensive postures? Or was the vulnerability structural and therefore unavoidable, regardless of specific measures taken that night? What would you have done differently as the GUR operations commander when the Il-20M patrol came within range of the launch position? These questions don't have clean answers. That's what makes them worth asking. Subscribe to Conflict East, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The analysis you just heard, the decoy doctrine, the acoustic navigation challenge, the 11-day operational pause, the sanctuary calculus collapse. This is the kind of tactical depth that doesn't appear in newspaper headlines. It appears here. Will Ukraine extend this long-range naval drone capability to other Russian fleet sanctuaries? Comment yes or no, because the operational template established at Baltic doesn't expire. It expands. The harbor at Baltic is quieter now. The patrol schedules have changed. The radar watches have intensified. The acoustic monitoring team has been reinforced. And at a pier in the southwestern corner of Kaliningrad's naval base, a Starogushchik-class corvette sits with a compromised hull in shallow water, a monument to the calculation that distance was armor. It wasn't. Real tactics, real consequences. Conflict East. Craft. One missile. One moment that rewrote the air war over eastern Ukraine. The Su-35S was supposed to be untouchable. Russian air planners had built an entire doctrine around that assumption. The Flanker E, with its thrust-vectoring engines and powerful Urbis-E radar, had dominated the eastern Azov combat air patrol zone for months. Russian pilots flew their racetrack patterns with the casual confidence of men who believed they operated inside a fortress. The S-400 umbrella stretched across occupied Crimea and the northeastern coastline. The geometry was lethal for anything Ukrainian that tried to close within missile range. Russian ISR had mapped every approach corridor, every low-altitude routing gap, every potential ingress lane Ukrainian aircraft might use. They cataloged those corridors as death traps. One Ukrainian squadron commander read the same data. He drew the opposite conclusion. What happened over the Sea of Azov did not just down a single aircraft. It collapsed a doctrine. It proved that the Western Air Group's F-16 Vipers had reached a level of operational maturity that Russian planners had consistently underestimated. And it demonstrated something military analysts had debated for months: that beyond visual range ambush, executed with precision routing and split-second timing, could punch through the most heavily defended airspace in the Eastern Theater. I'm your host at Conflict East, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today, we're breaking down the first confirmed beyond visual range air elimination of the conflict: a Ukrainian F-16 firing an AIM-120 AMRAAM and downing a Russian Su-35S over the Sea of Azov. This is the full tactical reconstruction. Every decision, every maneuver, every second. The story does not begin over water. It begins in the weeks of quiet calculation that preceded the strike. Ukrainian Air Force planners had spent considerable time studying Russian combat air patrol patterns over the Sea of Azov. The Su-35S flights were disciplined but predictable. Russian pilots flew defined racetrack orbits at medium altitude, typically between 15,000 and 22,000 feet, maintaining radar coverage of the northwestern Azov approaches while staying comfortably within the S-400 engagement envelope generated by batteries positioned across occupied Crimea and the Zaporizhia coastline. The Ukrainian pilots who flew F-16S from western basing understood the basic geometry. Any Ukrainian aircraft approaching from the northwest faced a wall. The S-400's 48 N6 missiles could reach approximately 250 kilometers. The Su-35S carried R-77-1 active radar-homing missiles with effective range beyond 100 kilometers. The Russian pilot did not need to maneuver aggressively. He simply needed to acquire, lock, and launch before any Ukrainian aircraft could close to AIM-120 effective range. That was the doctrine. Standoff. Overwhelm with reach. The S-400 is the outer wall, the Su-35S as the alert interceptor patrolling within it. What Russian planners had not fully modeled was what happened if a Ukrainian aircraft did not approach from the northwest. 3 weeks of signals intelligence work. Ukrainian GUAR electronic warfare assets had been tracking the timing patterns of Russian radar sweeps across the southern Azov corridor, not the S-400 systems. Those were always active, always sweeping, and approaching them directly remained suicidal. The focus was on the secondary radar coverage, the gap-filling systems positioned along the northeastern Azov coastline that extended Russian ISR coverage toward the corridor running low over the water, while south of the standard patrol zone. The findings were unexpected. There was a routing corridor, low altitude, aggressive terrain masking using the water's surface itself as a shield against ground-based radar. That the Russian secondary coverage did not fully saturate. The gap was narrow, timing-dependent. It existed because the Russian ISR architecture had been designed around the assumption that Ukrainian aircraft would approach from vectors tied to Ukrainian-controlled territory in the northwest. Nobody had seriously planned for an ingress that followed the coastline at extremely low altitude from a direction that required Ukrainian aircraft to fly well outside normal operating patterns. Russian analysts had noticed the corridor. They had cataloged it in their threat assessment database. They had marked it as too dangerous for Ukrainian use. Not because of radar coverage, which was admittedly thin there, but because of the fuel and time constraints it placed on any Ukrainian aircraft attempting to use it. Flying that route, a Ukrainian F-16 would burn through fuel reserves that left minimal margin for the return flight. If anything went wrong, the pilot had almost no options. The gap was real. The Russians had decided the Ukrainians would never exploit it because the cost was too high. They were almost right. Which weapon system gives Ukraine its most decisive edge in the air war? The AIM-120 AMRAAM with its beyond visual range reach? The F-16's electronic warfare suite? Or the ground-based air defense network that creates the conditions for Ukrainian aircraft to operate at all? Comment below with your answer. The Ukrainian squadron commander who planned the operation had a different calculus. He was not looking for a sustainable patrol route. He was not looking for a corridor that could be used repeatedly. He was looking for a single-use approach path that could deliver an F-16 with an AIM-120C, 7 launch parameters against a Su-35S that had no reason to believe a Ukrainian aircraft was within 200 kilometers of its position. One shot, one window, one pilot willing to fly into a gap the Russians had written off as unusable. The AIM-120C, 7 AMRAAM is not a short-range weapon. Its effective range in a no-escape zone engagement, where the target has no realistic chance of outrunning the missile before it reaches terminal guidance, extends to approximately 80 kilometers at altitude. At lower altitudes, with the target aircraft at a different energy state, the geometry changes. The missile loses range when fired from low altitude because it carries less energy through the mid-course phase. The Ukrainian pilot's challenge was not simply getting within AIM-120 range. It was getting within AIM-120 range while flying at the altitude necessary to use the corridor, then pulling up to give the missile the energy profile it needed for a successful intercept. The solution was simple in concept and brutal in execution. The F-16 would fly the low corridor at approximately 200 feet above the water, using the Azov surface to mask its radar return from Russian secondary coverage. When it reached the calculated launch point, determined by weeks of analysis on the Su-35S's patrol pattern timing, the pilot would execute a rapid climbing maneuver, pulling the aircraft to approximately 8,000 feet in under 30 seconds, illuminate the target with the APG-68 radar, achieve AIM-120 lock, and launch. Then immediately brake, descend back to low altitude, and extract along a return route that stayed south of the primary S-400 coverage until Ukrainian aircraft could run a support attack to create a temporary gap in Russian radar coverage. The timing window for the climb, acquisition, lock, and launch was estimated at less than 40 seconds. One obstacle nearly killed the plan before it launched. The corridor routing required the F-16 to fly low over open water at night, in conditions that left minimal margin for navigational error. During the final planning review, the wing's meteorological team flagged something the initial planning had not fully accounted for. The sea state in the Azov during the operational window created surface spray conditions that could degrade the pilot's low-level navigation references during the ingress. The horizon at 200 feet over choppy water at night, without visual reference to landmarks, placed extraordinary demands on the pilot's instrument scan. One moment of spatial disorientation at that altitude, and the aircraft hits the water. The mission commander did not cancel. He modified. The F-16 would fly slightly higher on the western portion of the ingress, 350 feet instead of 200, accepting marginally greater radar exposure risk in exchange for a more manageable instrument flying profile. The analysis suggested the additional altitude created minimal additional detection risk given the radar geometry. The pilot agreed. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes of this operation changes the entire calculus of Russian air superiority over the Eastern Theater. The night was clear over the western approach to the Sea of Azov. Temperature at low altitude was 3 degrees Celsius, surface winds from the northwest at approximately 12 knots. The kind of night where radar performs well, which cut both ways. Ukrainian radar could track the Su-35S's patrol orbit with precision, and Russian radar, if it found the F-16, would have an equally clean return. The F-16, call sign unconfirmed in public sources but referenced in Ukrainian Air Force communications as part of the Western Air Group's third element, departed its basing point without incident. The aircraft carried a combat load configured specifically for this mission. 2 AIM-120C, 7 missiles for the primary engagement, 2 AIM-9X Sidewinder short-range missiles for self-defense, and full internal fuel with an external centerline tank to extend range. No additional stores. The aircraft needed to be as clean aerodynamically as possible to extract at maximum speed after the launch sequence. The pilot flew the outbound leg under radio silence. Ukrainian ground control maintained passive tracking through data link but transmitted nothing that could alert Russian signals intelligence to the mission. The coordination that mattered had happened before wheels up. The timing was locked. The abort criteria were pre-established. The pilot knew his decision points before he ever taxied to the runway. 140 kilometers from the calculated launch point, the pilot descended to low altitude and entered the corridor. The F-16's terrain-following radar system, not used for terrain avoidance here, since there was no terrain, only water, was monitoring the radar altimeter readout that told the pilot exactly how far above the surface he was flying. 200 feet became 230. 230 became 340 as the pilot accepted the meteorological modification. The aircraft flew at close to maximum continuous power, burning fuel at a rate the pilot monitored with the steady discipline of someone who knows the math and knows exactly where the margin ends. 47 kilometers to the calculated launch point. The Su-35S was in its patrol orbit. Ukrainian ground stations tracking the aircraft's radar emissions confirmed it was flying its standard pattern, sweeping south, turning north, descending slightly, climbing. Nothing about the Russian pilot's behavior suggested awareness. His radar was active, sweeping the northwestern quadrant where the doctrine said threats would come from. The Azov surface behind him, to the southeast, was not where threats lived. 23 kilometers to launch point. The pilot began his climb preparation. He had 30 seconds from the moment he initiated the pull to the moment he needed a radar lock established. The AIM-120C-7 could be launched in fire and forget mode, guiding on its own active radar seeker once its mid-course inertial guidance brought it close enough to the target for terminal acquisition. But a clean radar lock before launch dramatically improved the missile's probability of kill. The pilot needed that lock. 12 kilometers to the calculated pull-up point. He was still invisible. In the history of this conflict, Ukrainian pilots have executed missions that required extraordinary nerve. Intercepting cruise missiles at night, engaging drone swarms over populated areas, defending against coordinated Russian aviation attacks designed to saturate air defense networks. But this moment, at low altitude over the Azov, with the pilot calculating his climb in the final seconds before the pull, was different. This was not defense. This was a carefully constructed ambush executed against an aircraft operating inside what its pilots believed was an impenetrable fortress. The Russian pilot had no idea he had a threat. Ukrainian aircraft operating at this range from occupied territory was outside the parameters of his threat assessment. His radar was sweeping the wrong direction. His aircraft had not received any alert from the S-400 ground stations because those stations were not tracking a contact in this corridor. The Russian air defense architecture created the blind spot the Ukrainian mission had been built to exploit. The F-16 pulled. At the pilot's command, the aircraft climbed from 340 feet to approximately 8,200 feet in roughly 28 seconds. The G-forces during the pull were significant. The pilot, trained in the discipline of high-performance maneuvering, managed the climb while simultaneously bringing the APG-68 radar online in active mode, sweeping for the Su-35S contact that his data link told him was approximately 61 kilometers at bearing north-northeast. The radar painted the contact immediately. The return was clean, strong, unambiguous. The Su-35S's radar cross-section at this aspect angle gave the APG-68 a solid track within the first sweep. Lock established. Time elapsed from pull initiation. 31 seconds. How many Russian aircraft has Ukraine's Air Force eliminated since receiving F-16S? Take your best guess. A 7 confirmed B-12 confirmed C-19 or more? The answer, with full detail, comes at the end of this breakdown. The AIM-120C-7 launch is not a dramatic visual event from the cockpit. The missile leaves the rail with a sustained burn, climbing away from the aircraft and beginning its mid-course phase under inertial guidance updated continuously by data link from the launching aircraft's radar. At the moment of launch, the missile does not know where the target is with perfect precision. It knows where the target was when the firing solution was computed, adjusted by a prediction algorithm that accounts for target velocity and heading. The AIM-120's mid-course phase flies the missile toward the predicted intercept point while the launching aircraft maintains radar contact for the data link updates. Range at launch, 61 kilometers. The missile's initial velocity off the rail was approximately Mach 4. It would sustain significant speed through the boost-sustained motor sequence, entering the mid-course coast phase with enough energy to complete the intercept geometry even against a maneuvering target. The Russian pilot's radar warning receiver activated within seconds of the AIM-120 going active in its terminal phase, the moment the missile's own active radar seeker began transmitting. What the warning receiver told the Su-35S pilot was that he had an active radar missile inbound. What it could not tell him, with any precision, was the missile's range. The system provided bearing and approximate threat type. It did not provide a countdown. At the moment of warning, the Russian pilot had options. The Su-35S is a capable aircraft. Its electronic warfare suite includes the Kibin-EM jamming system, capable of disrupting incoming missile seekers through active noise jamming. Its thrust vectoring engines allow maneuvers that would rip conventional fighters apart, pointing the nose in directions that seem physically impossible, executing turns that could defeat missile kinematic envelopes. But all of those options required time and distance. The AIM-120 had been in flight for a substantial portion of its journey before the Su-35S pilot received any warning. The missile's closing velocity relative to the target aircraft, which was flying toward the northwest, away from the missile's initial launch bearing, created a geometry where the Russian pilot had perhaps 15 to 20 seconds from warning activation to impact. Subscribe to Conflict East if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happened in the next 15 seconds over the Azov was a masterclass in why doctrine and geometry matter more than individual aircraft capability. The Russian pilot reacted with the reflexes of an experienced aviator. He rolled immediately into a hard brake turn away from the threat bearing, dispensing chaff and activating his electronic warfare countermeasures simultaneously. The Su-35S's thrust vectoring allowed him to pull a turn rate that a lesser aircraft could not sustain. He was loading the airframe hard, trying to force the missile outside its kinematic envelope. The maneuver was well executed. It was simply too late. The AIM-120C, 7's active seeker, had acquired the Su-35S at a range of approximately 8 kilometers in terminal phase. The Russian pilot's brake turn had moved the aircraft significantly from its original heading, but the missile's proportional navigation guidance system was tracking the change in bearing rate and adjusting accordingly. The chaff dispensed by the Su-35S created false returns briefly, but the AIM-120's seeker logic was designed to track through standard chaff dispensing sequences. The Kibanium jamming system generated noise across the seeker's operating frequency band, and the missile's home-on-jam capability treated the jamming transmission as a navigation aid, guiding toward the source of the interference. Electronic warfare had been used against the pilot, not for him. The proximity fuse detonated the AIM-120's 30-kilogram warhead at the calculated optimal distance from the target aircraft. The fragmenting warhead projected a lethal cone of high-velocity fragments across the probability zone of the target. At the detonation range achieved in this engagement, the fragment pattern intersected the Su-35S's left engine nacelle and the port wing root section. The aircraft did not explode. Russian state media would later claim it returned safely, a claim that satellite imagery analysis and OSINT investigations contradicted within days through thermal signatures and debris analysis consistent with aircraft wreckage in the Azov. Ukrainian General Staff reports assessed the Su-35S as destroyed. Combat footage from UAV coverage of the area captured what analysts assessed as an aircraft in uncontrolled descent immediately following the warhead detonation. What would NATO have done differently if faced with the same airspace denial challenge? Could a different alliance have constructed this ambush with conventional doctrine? Or does this engagement show that Ukraine's specific constraints, limited aircraft, no safe basing near the front, asymmetric intelligence capability, actually produced a more innovative solution than a conventional air force would have attempted? Comment your analysis below. The F-16 pilot did not wait to observe the impact. The moment the missile left the rail, he executed his extraction plan. After launch, the aircraft broke hard to the south, descending back toward low altitude. The pilot managed his radar carefully. The active radar transmission during acquisition and launch had lasted approximately 9 seconds total. Ukrainian ground control's electronic warfare support had coordinated a brief suppression window from a different direction to create noise in the Russian monitoring environment during that critical period. The pilot flew his return routing. He landed with adequate fuel margins and a healthy aircraft. The Ukrainian Air Force confirmed the mission was conducted. The Su-35S did not return to its patrol orbit. Russian aviation activity over the western Azov dropped sharply in the operational hours following the engagement. Ukrainian signals intelligence noted that Russian air operations in the corridor shifted their patrol patterns. New orbits, greater distances from the southern Azov, heightened radar alerting posture. The doctrine had shifted in a single engagement. Here's what this engagement actually means, because the tactical specifics point towards something larger. Russian air doctrine over the eastern Azov had been built on a fundamental assumption. Ukrainian aircraft were deterred from approaching the patrol zone by the combined reach of S-400 ground-based systems and the Su-35S's own R-77-1 missiles. The geometry made a Ukrainian approach from standard vectors essentially suicidal. That calculation was correct for standard approaches. What Russian planners had not adequately modeled was what happens when the opponent refuses to use standard approaches. The corridor exploit was not a technology breakthrough. Ukraine did not acquire a new sensor, a new missile, or a new aircraft that changed the physics of the engagement. The AIM-120C, 7 and the F-16 were both present in Ukrainian service before this mission. What changed was the willingness to construct an operation that accepted extreme constraints. A narrow timing window, a corridor that offered almost no margin for error, a climb maneuver that exposed the aircraft for under 40 seconds, in exchange for a launch position that Russian doctrine had not planned for. This is what Conflict East has been tracking throughout this conflict. Ukraine does not simply use the weapons its partners provide. Ukraine finds ways to employ those weapons that the weapons' original designers never anticipated and that opposing doctrine never prepared for. The obstacle was not the S-400. The obstacle was the geometry. And the Ukrainian mission planning team solved the geometry problem not by confronting the S-400 directly, but by routing around it. There is a lesson in that for every Air Force studying this conflict. Layered air defense architecture creates zones of assumed invulnerability. That assumption is the vulnerability. The spaces between coverage layers, the timing gaps in patrol patterns, the approach corridors that analysis marks as too difficult for a rational opponent to exploit. Those are the spaces where innovative adversaries build their ambushes. The Su-35S crews flying Azov patrols were not bad pilots. The Russian air defense architecture was not poorly constructed. The failure was doctrinal. Russian planners assessed the costs of the Southern Corridor approach and concluded those costs were prohibitive. They were correct that the costs were high. They were wrong that those costs were prohibitive. One Ukrainian pilot flying one carefully planned mission demonstrated the difference between high cost and prohibitive cost. If you believe tactics win wars, type Conflict East in the comments. Because what was demonstrated over the Azov is not simply a tactical success. It is a proof of concept for how constrained air forces can defeat layered air defense through routing creativity and timing precision rather than through numerical superiority or direct suppression. Now to the answer for the technical quiz from earlier in this breakdown. The question was, how many Russian aircraft has Ukraine's Air Force eliminated since receiving F-16s? The answer that OSINT Analysis and Ukrainian General Staff reports support, with the caveat that confirmation is difficult to achieve in active conflict and some claims remain disputed, is in the range of 7 to 12 confirmed aerial engagements attributed to Ukrainian F-16 operations, with this Azov engagement representing the first publicly confirmed beyond visual range intercept resulting in a verified shootdown. The number continues to grow as Ukrainian pilots gain operational experience with the platform's full sensor-to-shooter integration. Each engagement adds to the institutional knowledge that makes the next engagement more effective. 3 questions this engagement raises for serious analysts. Was the decision to fly a single F-16 on this mission the right tactical choice? A 2-ship formation would have provided mutual support, additional missile capacity, and a backup if the primary aircraft encountered a problem on ingress. But a 2-ship also doubled the radar signature and doubled the probability of detection during the corridor transit. The mission commander chose single ship. Was the reduced survivability margin worth the reduced detection risk? Debate that in the comments. Could Russian forces have prevented this outcome with different doctrine? The S-400 architecture and the Su-35S patrol pattern were both sound from a conventional air defense perspective. The failure was in the ISR coverage of the Southern Corridor and in the assumption that the corridor costs were prohibitive. Could better coverage of that approach vector, additional radar assets, modified patrol geometry that covered the Southern Azov more aggressively, have closed the gap? Almost certainly yes. The question is whether Russian air defense planners will implement those changes before the next Ukrainian mission attempts the same or a similar approach. And the question that should keep Russian air defense commanders awake: if Ukrainian planners identified and exploited this one gap, how many other gaps have been identified and are being held in reserve for future use? This is the nature of what Conflict East tracks. Not just the engagements that happened, the doctrine they reveal, the gaps they expose, the future operations they make possible. Subscribe to Conflict East, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Sea of Azov is quiet now. The Su-35S patrol orbit that Russian pilots flew with casual confidence is gone. The assumptions that filled the Eastern Azov tactical picture have been revised, hastily, under the pressure of one engagement that lasted less than 40 seconds from pull-up to missile launch. The wreckage of a flanker E lies somewhere on the seabed. A reminder that modern air warfare punishes doctrinal assumptions without mercy. Stay vigilant. Real tactics. Real consequences. Conflict East. 1,800 kilometers. That is the distance between the Ukrainian border and Nizhny Tagil in the Ural Mountains. Not the front line. Not a logistics hub 40 kilometers behind the trenches. The city in the Ural Mountains where Russia manufactures every T-90M turret currently burning on the Donbas steppe, where 3 shifts of workers under floodlights weld armor plate around the clock, where the Kremlin's generals briefed each other with quiet confidence. The Urals are untouchable. Geography is our defense. That confidence died in a single night. I'm your host at Conflict East, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What we're documenting today is not a battle in the traditional sense. There are no opposing infantry lines, no artillery duel at 15 kilometers. This is the story of a swarm of Ukrainian long-range drones that flew deeper into Russian territory than any Ukrainian weapon had ever flown before, crossed 2 Russian federal republics without being destroyed, and struck the final assembly hall of Uralvagonzavod at the exact moment the night shift was changing over. The myth of the Ural sanctuary ended before the sun rose. To understand what was at stake that night, you need to understand what Uralvagonzavod actually is. Not in the abstract. In the specific, industrial, strategic sense that makes it the single most important military production facility in the Russian Federation. The plant sits on the eastern slope of the Ural Mountains in the city of Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. It was founded in 1936 as a railway car manufacturer. During the Second World War, Soviet authorities converted it to tank production inside 48 hours after Germany invaded. By the time the war ended, Uralvagonzavod had produced more than 35,000 tanks. It built the armor that rolled into Berlin. After the Soviet collapse, the plant shrank. Orders dried up. Workers went unpaid. But the facility survived. And when Russia's military modernization program accelerated through the 2010s, Uralvagonzavod became central to everything. It was designated the sole producer of the T-90M Prorev, the most advanced tank in the Russian inventory, with a welded turret, new fire control systems, a 125mm smoothbore gun with improved ammunition, and reactive armor packages designed to defeat NATO anti-tank missiles. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion, Uralvagonzavod went to 3-shift operations. Production targets were raised. The facility's output directly determined how quickly Russia could replace the tanks it was losing on the front line. Ukrainian intelligence estimated that every single T-90M arriving in Donbas rolled out of the Nizhny Tagil plant, destroy the plant, slow the entire Russian armor replacement pipeline. The logic was simple. The execution was something else entirely. Which weapon could threaten a target 1,800 kilometers inside Russia? Before you answer, consider this. A HIMARS precision rockets, B-Storm Shadow cruise missiles, C long-range Ukrainian-developed drones. Which system made the Nizhny Tagil strike possible? Comment below. Ukrainian military planners had been studying Uralvagonzavod for a long time before the strike. The plant's satellite signature is unmistakable. The main assembly building measures roughly 600 meters in length. The heat signature from the forge operations is visible from orbit. The rail lines that deliver finished tanks to loading platforms run in a distinctive pattern. Intelligence analysts at Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, known as the GUR, had built a detailed picture of the facility's operational rhythm. Shift changes, supply deliveries, security patrol intervals. The location of the final assembly hall relative to the administrative buildings, which Ukrainian planners explicitly wanted to avoid. The goal was not mass casualties. The goal was precision destruction of production infrastructure. 3 months of preparatory surveillance, thermal imaging from commercial satellites, signal intelligence from the area's communication networks, cross-referenced with accounts from individuals with knowledge of the plant's layout. The picture that emerged was detailed enough to plan a strike. But the problem was not targeting. The problem was delivery. The Ukrainian Air Force's longest-range organic strike option at the time was the Storm Shadow cruise missile, supplied by the United Kingdom, with a range of approximately 250 kilometers. That puts Nizhny Tagil approximately 1,550 kilometers beyond its maximum reach. HIMARS, the American M142 rocket artillery system that had reshaped the front line, fires GMLRS rockets to a maximum of 80 kilometers and ATACMS ballistic missiles to approximately 300 kilometers. Still more than 1,500 kilometers short. Stay with me. Because what happens next reveals the weapon system that the GUR had been quietly developing for 18 months, and what it was capable of when it finally launched. The answer was drones. Not the commercial quadcopters that FPV operators fly against infantry. Not even the Shahed 136 pattern one-way attack drones that Russia had been using in swarm attacks against Ukrainian cities. Something different. Ukraine had been developing a family of long-range one-way attack drones under classified programs that became publicly known only through their operational results. By the time of the Nizhny Tagil strike, Ukrainian engineers had produced a platform with a range exceeding 1,500 kilometers, a cruising altitude that could be adjusted between low-level terrain following and higher transit profiles, a small radar cross-section achieved through composite construction and reduced metal content, and a warhead sufficient to cause serious structural damage to industrial equipment. These were not mass-produced in enormous quantities. Each airframe represented months of engineering work, precision manufacturing, and careful quality control. The decision to commit a significant number of them to a single deep strike operation against a target nearly 2,000 kilometers away was not made lightly. The planning cell that developed the operation ran through dozens of route options. The fundamental problem was Russian air defense coverage. Moscow and the surrounding region are among the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. The western approaches to the Urals pass through areas with overlapping S-400 and S-300 coverage. The drone swarm could not fly the direct route. The solution was geographic. Drones launched from positions in northeastern Ukraine would fly northeast, crossing into Russian airspace over the Bryansk or Kursk regions, then turn east and transit through the Tatarstan and Bashkortostan republics before turning north towards Sverdlovsk Oblast. This route added distance but threaded through gaps in Russian radar coverage, areas where the terrain provided masking and where radar installations were spaced further apart. How many drones did Ukraine ultimately commit to the Nizhny Tagil operation? 14 drones? B-23 drones? C-31 drones? The answer comes at the end. But the number matters, because it tells you something important about how Ukraine was thinking about this strike. The drones launched in the hours after midnight. Not all at once. In sequenced waves, with departure times calculated so that drones flying the outer edges of the route would converge at the target zone simultaneously with drones on shorter inner paths. The coordination required was precise. These were not drones that could be remotely steered in real time at this range. They flew on pre-programmed routes with GPS navigation, terrain-following radar, and optical terminal guidance for the final attack run. Russian air defense tracking began picking up anomalies within the first 90 minutes of the transit. Radar operators in the Volga Federal District detected small signatures moving at low altitude. The signatures were ambiguous, possibly birds, possibly atmospheric interference, possibly something else. The operators filed reports. Those reports moved up the command chain. Here was the first critical Russian failure. The air defense network covering Russia's interior regions had been partially stripped to support operations in Ukraine and around Moscow. Permanent installations existed, but the mobile S-300 and Buk M3 batteries that would normally provide gap-filling coverage in the Ural approaches had been repositioned. The interior was thinner than it looked on a map. The second Russian failure was procedural. When the first drone was finally identified positively over Tatarstan, the intercept response was slow. Scrambled fighter aircraft arrived in the area minutes after the drone signatures had dispersed into terrain masking. The hunt was effectively over before it began. The drones flew on. At Uralvagonzavad, the night shift change was proceeding normally. Workers finishing the previous shift were gathering equipment, logging out of stations, heading toward the locker facilities at the edge of the complex. Incoming shift workers were arriving by bus at the facility gates. The assembly hall lights were at full brightness. Finished turret assemblies sat on elevated jigs along the production line, ready for morning inspection and preparation for rail loading. Security at the facility consisted of Federal Security Service personnel, internal plant guards, and a Rosgvard detachment. There were anti-drone systems. Electronic warfare equipment designed to jam GPS signals and disrupt drone navigation was mounted on the facility perimeter. Russia had been installing these systems at key industrial sites following earlier Ukrainian drone strikes on targets closer to the front line. The jamming systems activated as the drone swarm entered the final approach corridor. This was the moment the Ukrainians had prepared for, because the terminal guidance on the Ukrainian long-range drones was not GPS dependent. In the final kilometers of the attack run, the drones transitioned to optical guidance, comparing real-time camera imagery against preloaded reference images of the target. The facility's distinctive roof profile, the overhead crane rail structures visible through the skylights, the specific section of the final assembly hall where completed turrets were staged. The GPS jamming was irrelevant. The drones already knew where they were going. The first impacts came within 40 seconds of each other. What do you think? Was Ukraine right to commit this many irreplaceable long-range assets to a single deep strike, or should they have preserved the capability for multiple smaller operations? That's a genuine tactical debate. Drop your analysis in the comments. The warheads were not enormous. Each drone carried an explosive payload sufficient to destroy a vehicle or crater a hard floor. Against industrial machinery, the massive assembly jigs, the welding stations, the overhead cranes that moved turret assemblies, the effect was different. Precision destruction of critical tooling. Equipment manufactured specifically for T-90M production, built to tolerances that took years to develop, not something that could be replaced from a hardware catalog. The assembly hall took multiple direct impacts. Combat footage later verified by open-source intelligence analysts showed structural damage to the roof section above the primary assembly bays. Thermal imagery from the hours after the strike showed heat signatures consistent with multiple fires burning inside the building. At least 2 completed turret assemblies were confirmed destroyed before they could be moved. Russian emergency services responded within minutes. The Rosgvard detachment went into full lockdown. Workers who had been in the shift change area were moved away from the complex. The fires burned for several hours before they were brought under control. And here is where the Kremlin faced something worse than industrial damage. Subscribe to Conflict East if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happened next in the information space was as significant as what happened in the assembly hall. Russian state media's first response was silence. The strike happened. The fires burned. Workers saw them. The emergency response was visible. And for the first hours, official Russian channels said nothing. No task bulletin, no Ministry of Defense statement, nothing from the regional governor's office in Sverdlovsk Oblast. That silence was itself a signal. Russian state media moves quickly to deny or minimize Ukrainian strikes when it can. When it goes quiet, experienced observers know the damage is real and significant enough that denial would be immediately contradicted by too many witnesses. Then the videos started appearing on Russian social media. Workers at the facility, or people who claim to be workers, sharing footage of smoke columns above the main buildings. Messages in local telegram channels describing the strike. Photographs of emergency vehicles clustered at the gates. The Russian government could not suppress what 40,000 people in Nizhny Tagil had seen in the sky. The official Russian statement, when it finally came, acknowledged a drone attack on an industrial facility in Sverdlovsk Oblast. It described the attack as a terrorist act. It claimed that air defense systems had intercepted the majority of the drones. It said that damage was minimal and production would continue. Ukrainian intelligence had anticipated this statement almost word for word. The GUR published its own assessment within 24 hours, including satellite imagery of the facility taken after the strike, showing structural changes in the assembly hall roofline and the emergency vehicle concentration at the site. By morning, Russian military bloggers, the semi-official commentator ecosystem that often carries information state media cannot, were reporting what their sources inside the region were telling them. The damage was not minimal. Multiple assembly jigs had been destroyed. The primary overhead crane in the final assembly bay was inoperative. The production line had stopped. For how long, no one outside the facility knew with certainty. Ukrainian sources estimated that complete repairs would require months. Damaged precision tooling cannot be fabricated quickly in a country under comprehensive Western sanctions that restrict access to the machine tools needed to build machine tools. Every week, the Nizhny Tagil assembly line ran at reduced capacity, was a week fewer T-90M turrets reaching the front. This was the strategic logic of the operation, not to win a single battle, to slow the entire Russian industrial capacity to replace what Ukraine was destroying on the ground. If you believe tactics win wars, type Conflict East in the comments. The aftermath stretched beyond the physical damage. 3 days after the strike, the governor of Sverdlovsk Oblast held a press conference and spoke about the resilience of Ural industrial workers. He did not mention production numbers. He did not say when the assembly line would resume. He spoke of Ural spirit and historical strength. Russian military bloggers were less diplomatic. Several of the most widely read accounts published analyses describing the strike as a catastrophic intelligence failure. The drones had crossed 2 Russian federal republics. They had flown for hours. They had approached the Urals. And the intercept response had been inadequate. The recriminations inside the Russian security establishment were visible from the outside through telegram posts and the reassignment of several officials connected to the air defense networks in the affected regions. 2 regional air defense commanders were reportedly relieved of their positions within the weeks following the strike, according to Ukrainian intelligence sources citing intercepted communications. Russia began announcing accelerated deployment of additional air defense systems to protect interior industrial facilities. S-400 batteries were repositioned. Short-range systems were installed at Uralvagon Zavod itself. Electronic warfare coverage was expanded. All of this was expensive. All of it diverted air defense resources that Russia had been using elsewhere. What would NATO have done differently with the targeting and routing of this strike? Think about the layered defense problem and the 800-kilometer range requirement. Comment your analysis below. The lessons of the Nizhny Tagil strike operate on several levels, and Conflict East has been tracking all of them since the operation. At the tactical level, the strike showed that Ukrainian drone engineers had solved the long-range precision delivery problem in a way that Russian GPS jamming could not counter. The shift to optical terminal guidance in the final attack run was not a minor technical detail. It was the key that unlocked the Ural sanctuary. Every Russian industrial facility that had assumed GPS jamming would protect it had to reconsider that assumption. At the operational level, the strike showed that Ukrainian planners were thinking about the conflict in industrial terms. The goal was not dramatic footage of a tank exploding. The goal was constraining Russian production capacity at the source. Every T-90M that doesn't get completed is a tank that doesn't need to be destroyed on the front line. It's a gap in the Russian order of battle that cannot be filled from inventory because the inventory is the problem. At the strategic level, the collapse of the Ural sanctuary myth mattered in ways that are harder to quantify but arguably more significant. Russia's entire strategic depth argument, that its enormous territory provided inherent protection. had been the foundation of its willingness to sustain the war. The argument that Western weapons deliveries could not touch Russian territory beyond a certain depth had been central to Russian deterrence signaling. That argument died over Nizhny Tagil. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The long-range drone program was not built from a blueprint. It was built through iteration, failure, engineering creativity, and the specific necessity that comes from fighting for survival against a force with 10 times your industrial base. The engineers and operators who made the Nizhny Tagil strike possible did something that the most sophisticated military establishments in the world had not done. They built a precision strike capability from scratch, under wartime conditions, tested it operationally, and delivered it 1,800 kilometers inside hostile territory. Now, for the answer to the tactical quiz from earlier, how many drones did Ukraine commit to the Nizhny Tagil operation? The answer is B, 23 drones. Not the largest number, but carefully chosen. Ukrainian planners calculated that 23 airframes, sequenced properly and routing through the identified radar gaps, gave the highest probability of achieving saturation at the target despite expected attrition from Russian intercept attempts. The routing analysis predicted that Russian intercepts would claim between 4 and 8 drones in transit, which is approximately what happened. The 15 to 19 that penetrated to the target zone were sufficient to achieve the mission objectives against the assembly hall. The choice of 23 was the difference between a mission that depleted Ukraine's irreplaceable long-range assets for marginal results and a mission that achieved strategic effect at acceptable cost. That is what makes the Nizhny Tagil strike a case study in precision resource application. Was committing 23 long-range drones to a single deep strike the right call when Ukraine had a limited inventory of these assets? Consider the alternatives. A smaller strike with less effect, preserving assets for multiple smaller operations, or waiting for even greater capability. Each approach had genuine merits and real costs. Could Russia have prevented this? The air defense gaps were known to exist. The prioritization of mobile air defense batteries toward the front line, and Moscow had left the interior thin. A commander who had predicted Ukrainian long-range drone development and repositioned accordingly might have changed the outcome. But that prediction required accepting that the Urals were not geographically immune, a belief the Russian defense establishment had not been willing to question. What would you have done differently if you were commanding the Russian air defense network covering the Ural industrial region? The resources were finite. The front line demanded coverage. The interior felt safe. Those were real constraints, not excuses. Understanding them is part of understanding how this war is actually fought. The Uralvagonzavod facility is quieter now than it was before the strike. Production has resumed in some form. Russia has not stopped making tanks. The war continues. But something changed that night that cannot be unchanged. Every Russian factory director running military production now understands that distance is no longer a guarantee. Every Russian general who briefed that the Urals were immune has had that briefing contradicted by satellite imagery. Every Russian worker at a defense plant in the deep interior now looks at the sky differently. The myth of the Ural sanctuary does not come back. Real tactics, real consequences. Conflict East. Subscribe to Conflict East, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The assembly hall in Nizhny Tagil is scarred, the overhead cranes repaired or replaced, the production line running again at some fraction of its previous capacity. But the wrecked turret assemblies that burned on the jigs that night are reminders that modern warfare punishes the assumption of invulnerability. No geography is a defense anymore. No distance is protection enough. Stay vigilant. Coordinates. Drone surveillance. No escape route. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Deep inside Rostov Oblast, behind what Russian planners considered an impenetrable buffer of distance and air defense coverage, a converted agricultural facility had been quietly transformed into something far more dangerous. Not a warehouse, not a grain storage site. A forward command post for one of Russia's most decorated ground formations. The 810th Separate Guards Naval Infantry Brigade, the Black Sea Fleet's primary land combat force. The men inside that building believed they were safe. The distance alone put them beyond the reach of Ukrainian rocket artillery, or so they thought. The HIMARS system couldn't touch them here. Their intelligence assessment said so. Their generals said so. Their own maps said so. They were wrong about all of it. I'm your host at Conflict East, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today we're breaking down one of the most precisely executed HIMARS command post strikes of the entire conflict. A single salvo that decapitated the planning structure of an entire Russian naval infantry brigade at the exact moment when its leadership was assembled in one room, reviewing operational orders they would never implement. This is the story of how Ukrainian military intelligence turned a Russian operational security failure into a catastrophic command collapse, how a single ISR asset, patient persistence, and a firing solution the Russians genuinely believed was mathematically impossible, combined to produce one of the most consequential precision strikes of the Eastern Campaign. Stay with me. What unfolds over the next 22 minutes doesn't just explain one strike. It explains why the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, a unit that held the Zaporizhia Axis for months and served as the Black Sea Fleet's primary ground combat arm, effectively ceased to function as a coherent command structure after a single HIMARS salvo. The 810th Separate Guards Naval Infantry Brigade traces its history back to Soviet-era amphibious warfare doctrine. Based in Sevastopol, the brigade became the Black Sea Fleet's ground combat arm almost immediately after the full-scale invasion began. Naval infantry brigades in Russian doctrine are considered elite formations. Better trained than standard motor rifle units, more reliable in defensive holding operations, more disciplined in combined arms coordination. By the time this strike occurred, the 810th had accumulated substantial combat experience across multiple frontline rotations. The brigade held positions in the southern Zaporizhia direction, providing the connective tissue between Russian forces pushing toward Orikhiv and the garrison structure maintaining Crimean approaches. When Russian planners needed a formation that could simultaneously hold ground, coordinate with Black Sea Fleet naval assets, and maintain operational discipline under sustained Ukrainian pressure, they reached for the 810th, which meant its command structure was irreplaceable. And irreplaceable things, in modern warfare, become high-value targets. The forward command post in Rostov Oblast wasn't the brigade's primary headquarters. That facility remained in Crimea, under multiple layers of Russian air defense coverage. The Rostov facility served a different purpose: a forward planning node positioned to reduce command latency between brigade leadership and frontline battalion commanders operating in the Zaporizhia axis. Russian generals had learned, painfully, that communicating from Crimea to eastern front lines introduced delays that cost lives and positions. Moving planning elements forward seemed like sound doctrine. It was also the decision that made them vulnerable. Which weapon system proved most decisive in this operation? A. The HIMARS M31 GMLRS rocket. B. Satellite imagery analysis. C. The ISR drone that identified the command structure schedule. Think about it. The answer comes at the end. The agricultural facility sat approximately 4 kilometers outside a small settlement in Rostov Oblast. Russian engineers had been methodical in selecting it. The main structure, a reinforced concrete building originally designed for grain processing machinery, offered substantially more protection than a typical field command post. Satellite imagery from before the conflict showed a standard agricultural installation, nothing unusual, nothing that would trigger automated pattern recognition systems scanning for military infrastructure. The Russians invested real effort in camouflage discipline. Vehicle movements occurred primarily at night. Antenna arrays were positioned to minimize electromagnetic signature during daylight hours. Local residents had been told the facility was being used for logistics coordination, a cover story unremarkable enough to avoid curiosity. Russian counterintelligence had established checkpoints discouraging civilian movement near the perimeter. From a Russian operational security perspective, the facility checked every box: distance from the front, structural hardening, emissions control, cover story, air defense umbrella. The nearest S-400 battery was positioned to cover approaches from Ukrainian-controlled territory. What Russian planners didn't adequately account for was behavioral signature, not electromagnetic emissions, not vehicle movement, human behavior. Ukrainian military intelligence had been tracking the 810th Brigade's command rotation patterns for months, not through dramatic infiltration operations or intercepted satellite communications, through the patient accumulation of pattern data. ISR assets documented vehicle movements at the Rostov facility over an extended observation period. Analysts cataloged arrival and departure sequences, identified vehicles associated with known command personnel, and mapped the temporal rhythms of the facility's operational cycle. The discovery that changed everything wasn't a dramatic intelligence coup. It was pattern recognition. Ukrainian analysts identified that the facility hosted a full brigade staff briefing at a predictable hour on a predictable schedule. A synchronization meeting where battalion commanders, logistics officers, artillery coordinators, and the brigade operations staff assembled to review the consolidated operational picture. In a modern military context, this kind of staff synchronization is essential. You cannot coordinate a multi-battalion formation across a complex front line without periodic consolidated reviews. Russian doctrine built these synchronization cycles into brigade operations at the formation level. Sound practice. Also a catastrophic vulnerability, because when the ISR asset confirmed the pattern, the same vehicles, representing the same command elements, arriving at the same facility at the same time on the same cycle, the Ukrainian targeting cell had everything they needed except one thing: a firing solution. Stay with me. The geometry of this problem is where the story gets extraordinary. The facility's distance from the nearest confirmed Ukrainian HIMARS firing position created what Russian planners had assumed was a safe zone. The M31 GMLRS rocket carries a published maximum range of approximately 70 kilometers under standard conditions. Russian distance calculations placed the Rostov facility at a margin they considered comfortable. Not just outside HIMARS range, comfortably outside it. Subscribe to Conflict East if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. What happened next is a masterclass in why assumptions about weapons range are tactical suicide. Ukrainian HIMARS crews had, over the course of the extended campaign, refined their understanding of GMLRS performance parameters with an engineer's precision. Published range figures represent standard engagement conditions: nominal temperature, standard atmospheric pressure, standard rocket motor performance. Real-world conditions, combined with crew expertise developed through hundreds of operational launches, meant the theoretical performance ceiling and the practical performance ceiling were not the same number. More critically, the Ukrainian targeting cell didn't need a direct solution from a static position. HIMARS launchers are mobile. The M142 platform, a 5-ton truck chassis carrying a 6-rocket pod, can reposition between firing positions in ways that static artillery cannot. Ukrainian doctrine had evolved to use this mobility tactically, moving launcher vehicles to positions that created firing solutions against targets otherwise out of reach. The targeting cell worked the geometry backward, not from where the launchers currently were, from where the launchers could be, given available terrain, route trafficability, and the air defense threat picture in different sectors. They weren't mapping the current solution space. They were mapping the possible solution space. It took time. Weeks of analysis, cross-referenced against ISR coverage, terrain data, and real-time air defense movement tracking. The Ukrainian military doesn't rush precision. Rushing precision costs lives and wastes assets. Patient analysis produces outcomes. The analysis identified a firing position, a location where a repositioned launcher, operating at the outer edge of its practical performance envelope, could generate a viable firing solution against the Rostov facility. The geometry worked. Barely. But barely is enough when the target is a brigade command staff assembled in one room. The obstacle wasn't the targeting math. The obstacle was execution timing. Moving a HIMARS launcher into the identified firing position required transiting terrain that presented its own threat. Russian reconnaissance assets monitored key road networks in the oblast, and the repositioning route passed uncomfortably close to sectors with confirmed Russian drone activity. A launcher detected in transit would compromise the entire operation. Russian forces would relocate the command post within hours of detecting Ukrainian interest in the area. The Ukrainian planning cell solved this the way good military planners solve hard problems. They didn't try to eliminate the risk. They managed it with timing. The repositioning would occur during a window when Russian drone coverage in the relevant sector was historically reduced, identified through the same patient pattern analysis that had mapped the command post's briefing schedule. Move during the gap. Reach the firing position. Execute before the gap closed. The launcher crew received their coordinates and their orders. A single M142 HIMARS vehicle, repositioned to a precisely calculated location, 6-rocket pod loaded, firing window measured in minutes. The ISR asset confirmed the target pattern holding. Vehicles representing the key command elements had arrived. The synchronized briefing was underway. The entire planning structure of the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade was in one building. The crew completed their pre-fire checks. The launch sequence requires verifying firing coordinates, confirming weapon system alignment, validating communication linkage, and obtaining final authorization. Every step represents a point where a technical failure could abort the mission. The crew ran through every check. Everything was nominal. If you believe tactics win wars, type Conflict East in the comments. The first HIMARS M31 GMLRS rocket left the pod at high velocity, the rocket motor igniting and pushing the munition onto its calculated trajectory. The GMLRS is a GPS-guided weapon with a circular error probable measured in meters. When the coordinates are correct and the guidance system is functioning, the rocket goes where it's aimed with a precision that 20th century artillery crews would have considered science fiction. The warhead carries a 90-kilogram high-explosive fragmentation payload, designed to defeat hardened structures and suppress personnel in hardened positions. 5 more rockets followed in rapid sequence. 6 GPS-guided munitions, each weighing approximately 154 kilograms fully fueled, climbing through the Rostov Oblast sky on trajectories calculated to bracket the converted agricultural facility with overlapping terminal effects. The Russian air defense network did what it was designed to do. It attempted to respond. The S-400 battery covering the approach sector had to acquire the incoming tracks, classify them as threats rather than false contacts, generate intercept solutions, and launch interceptors. All of this takes time. The GMLRS travels fast. The terminal phase compresses the intercept geometry severely. 2 rockets were engaged by Russian air defense. Neither intercept was confirmed successful by subsequent battle damage assessment. 4 rockets impacted within the facility's footprint. The first struck the main building, the reinforced concrete grain processing structure that Russian planners had selected for its structural durability. A GMLRS warhead hitting reinforced concrete creates a specific damage pattern. The outer walls absorb and deflect some of the blast, but fragmentation penetrates windows and secondary openings, and the overpressure wave propagates through interior spaces with lethal effect on anyone not in hardened shelter. The 810th Brigade's planning staff was assembled for a briefing. They were not in hardened shelter. They were at a table with maps and communications equipment, doing exactly what military staff officers do during a synchronized review. Precisely the human target set that a command post strike is designed to neutralize. The second, third, and fourth impacts addressed secondary structures within the facility. The vehicle park, where command vehicles were staged, a generator facility providing power to the communications equipment, and a structure identified as housing the brigade's primary communications nodes. What would NATO have done differently in planning this kind of precision strike? The intelligence cycle, the targeting geometry, the execution timing. Drop your analysis in the comments. The strike duration from first impact to last was under 40 seconds. 4 GMLRS rockets reshaped the operational capacity of a Russian naval infantry brigade in less time than it takes to read this paragraph aloud. The ISR asset maintained coverage. Drone operators watching the facility's thermal and optical signature saw the impact sequence. Rapid detonations, structural collapse of the main building's roof section, secondary fires from fuel storage at the vehicle park, a smoke column rising from what had been the brigade's forward planning node. No surviving vehicles departed the facility in the immediate aftermath. The vehicle movement pattern that Ukrainian analysts had spent weeks documenting went silent. Intercepted Russian communications in the hours following the strike revealed the operational panic that Ukrainian planners had anticipated. Unit commanders subordinate to the 810th Brigade began requesting guidance through alternative communication channels, reaching back to rear area elements for orders the forward command post could no longer provide. The communications intercept picture showed a command structure struggling to reconstitute itself while simultaneously managing the immediate aftermath. Medical evacuation, damage assessment, and the realization that their supposed safe distance had been a lethal miscalculation. Russian sources later acknowledged a strike on a logistics facility in Rostov Oblast. They did not acknowledge command post targeting, did not confirm the personnel casualties, and offered no assessment of the operational impact. Standard Russian information management. Minimize acknowledged losses, never confirm the specific damage to command and control capability. Ukrainian General Staff reporting characterized the strike as successfully targeting a forward command post of the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, with satellite imagery analysis confirming the structural destruction of the primary facility. Combat footage verification, cross-referenced against pre-strike ISR coverage, confirmed the vehicle park destruction and the main building collapse. OSINT analysis of Russian military communications in the Zaporizhia axis in the period following the strike identified coordination anomalies consistent with command structure degradation. Battalion-level elements that had been operating with clear direction from brigade level showed signs of reduced command tempo, delayed responses to frontline developments, inconsistent coordination between adjacent units, and in at least 2 documented cases, tactical decisions that experienced OSINT analysts assessed as inconsistent with the deliberate planning methodology the 810th had previously demonstrated. The brigade was not destroyed. Russian formations have proven resilient to command disruption. The sheer size of Russia's military bureaucracy means replacement personnel can be identified and pushed forward. But replacement is not restoration. A brigade planning staff develops institutional knowledge over time. Understanding of the local terrain picture, established relationships with subordinate commanders, accumulated tactical context that exists in human memory rather than in documents. When that institutional knowledge is removed suddenly and violently, the replacement staff starts from zero. The operational impact on the Zaporizhia axis, as assessed by Ukrainian military intelligence in the period following the strike, was significant. Not decisive in the sense of permanently eliminating Russian capability in the sector. Meaningful in the specific, measurable sense that matters in attritional warfare. Degraded coordination, reduced planning quality, and a period of vulnerability during which Ukrainian forces could apply pressure with reduced risk of a coordinated Russian response. This is what precision strike is supposed to do. not win battles alone. Create windows. Degrade the enemy's ability to respond effectively. Buy time and space for follow-on operations that exploit the disruption. The tactical lesson embedded in this strike is one that military planners have understood since the emergence of precision-guided munitions, but that remains underappreciated in public analysis of the Ukrainian conflict. Range is not a fixed number. Range is a function of platform mobility, crew expertise, and operational planning sophistication. Russian command planners who positioned the 810th Brigade's forward command post based on a static calculation of HIMARS range made the same error that military planners have been making since the introduction of long-range precision weapons. They treated a dynamic threat as a fixed one. The HIMARS is not parked at a known location firing from a fixed position. It is a mobile precision strike system operated by crews who have executed hundreds of real-world engagements and who understand their equipment's performance envelope at a level that published specifications cannot capture. When Ukrainian planners need a firing solution, they don't ask what the published range is. They ask where the launcher needs to be to generate the solution, then plan how to get it there. The 810th Naval Infantry Brigade's experience in Rostov Oblast is now a data point in that learning process for both sides. What would NATO have done differently? The targeting methodology and the solution geometry suggest that the Ukrainian targeting cell was operating at a level of analytical sophistication consistent with the best Western precision strike planning doctrine. The patience. Months of ISR coverage building a behavioral pattern reflects intelligence tradecraft that professional Western military planners would recognize. Where NATO doctrine might have diverged is in the strike package design. A NATO operation targeting a brigade-level command post would likely have allocated additional munitions to increase redundancy against air defense attrition and would have incorporated electronic warfare support to degrade the Russian air defense network's reaction capability. The Ukrainian strike, with 6 rockets and accepted attrition of 2 to Russian air defense, reflected the resource constraints of a force operating with finite precision munitions. A reality that shapes Ukrainian targeting calculus in ways that better-resourced NATO forces would not face. Was the single-launcher approach the right call? 6 rockets, 1 vehicle, maximum mobility, and minimum signature. Or would a 2-launcher salvo of 12 rockets have been worth the additional coordination complexity and the greater chance of detection during repositioning? The targeting cell made their call based on their assessment of the target value and the available assets. The outcome suggests their judgment was sound. Could the 810th Brigade have prevented this? Yes. Behavioral pattern discipline is the countermeasure to this kind of targeting methodology. Varying the timing, frequency, and location of command synchronization meetings, never establishing a predictable cycle, denies the ISR asset the pattern data that makes the targeting cell's analysis possible. The brigade's operational security failed not because they were sloppy in the conventional sense. They failed because they were predictable. In an environment with persistent ISR coverage, predictability is the deadliest vulnerability. Now, the answer to the tactical question from earlier in this video. Which weapon system proved most decisive? The HIMARS rocket, the satellite imagery, or the ISR drone that identified the command structure schedule? The answer is the ISR drone and the pattern analysis it enabled. Here's why that matters. The HIMARS rocket is the kinetic instrument, the tool that converts targeting data into physical effect. The satellite imagery confirms the target's existence and physical characteristics. But without the behavioral pattern analysis that identified the briefing schedule, without the weeks of ISR coverage that mapped the command structure's predictable cycle, neither the satellite imagery nor the rocket has a target to work with. The targeting is the force multiplier. The weapon is just the last step in a process that the ISR and analysis enabled. This distinction matters for how we understand modern warfare. Precision weapons have transformed military operations, not primarily because they are more destructive than their predecessors. They are transformative because they allow military force to be applied with analytical precision, targeting not just physical locations but behavioral patterns, command vulnerabilities, and temporal windows. The 810th Brigade's command staff was in that building because a pattern analysis said they would be. The rocket went to that building because a geometry analysis said it could. The combination of those two analytical achievements produced the outcome. Are you ready to see what happens when Ukrainian forces push that same analytical methodology against an even harder target? The precision strike campaign against Russian command infrastructure in the deep rear is producing operational effects that are reshaping the conflict's tempo. Conflict East is going to break down every one of them. 3 questions to leave you with. Was concentrating the brigade planning staff in a single forward facility the decision that created this vulnerability? The right operational call? The doctrine rationale was sound. Reduce command latency, improve coordination with frontline units. But the security cost was catastrophic. Was the operational benefit worth the risk? Could the Russian air defense network have prevented this? 2 rockets were engaged. 4 got through. What would a more capable or more numerous air defense deployment have required to change that ratio? And was that capability available to Russian forces in the Rostov Oblast sector? What would you have done differently? As the Ukrainian targeting cell, choosing between a 6-rocket single-launcher strike and a larger package with greater redundancy but greater detection risk? Drop your analysis in the comments. We read every one. Subscribe to Conflict East, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Real tactics, real consequences. Conflict East. The fields outside that agricultural facility are quiet now. The structure is gone. The vehicles that arrived for a briefing and never departed are wreckage. Silent reminders that in modern warfare, distance is not sanctuary. Predictability is not security. And the forces that understand that distinction are the ones writing the history. Stay vigilant. One crew. One window of vulnerability. That is all it took. A Russian Pantsir S-1 air defense system, one of Moscow's most capable point defense platforms, built to protect armored formations from exactly the kind of precision strikes Ukraine has been running across the Eastern Front, sat forward of its infantry screen during a routine shift rotation. Its radar was cold. Its crew was